In 1947, a young shepherd threw a stone into a cave and heard something break. He was not looking for anything. He was just a boy doing what boys do in the desert, throwing rocks into dark places to hear what happens. The cave was in the cliffs above the Dead Sea, in a place called Qumran. The sound he heard was a clay jar shattering. Inside that jar were scrolls. They had been sitting in the dark for more than 2,000 years. The longest scroll, the best preserved of all of them, was the book of Isaiah. All of it, 66 chapters, written by hand on 17 sheets of leather sewn together, stretching nearly 24 feet long, written by people who lived at least 100 years before Jesus was born. Someone had hidden it there, carefully, deliberately, wrapped it, sealed it, placed it in a jar, and put it in a cave where no one would find it. Now here is the question that matters. Not why they hid it, but what they believed about it that made it worth hiding. What was in those 66 chapters that a community of people, facing something they knew they could not survive, decided needed to outlast them? Part of the answer is this. Inside that scroll, in a section that scholars now call chapter 53, there are 12 verses. 12 verses written at least 100 years before Jesus of Nazareth was born. And those 12 verses describe someone being pierced for the transgressions of others. Someone who does not open his mouth when he is led to slaughter, like a lamb that does not resist the hand that guides it. Someone who makes his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death. Someone whose days are prolonged after he is cut off from the land of the living. 12 verses, written before Jesus was born, describing something that serious readers, Jewish and Christian, believing and skeptical, have been unable to simply set aside for more than 2,000 years. Not because the language is vague, because it is specific in ways that specificity should not allow. We will get there. We will spend a full chapter with those 12 verses, reading them slowly, staying with each image, sitting with the question that a man named Philip asked a traveler, reading them in a chariot on a desert road 2,000 years ago, and that has never stopped being the right question. But we cannot go there yet. Because without the man who wrote them, the verses are just words on leather, extraordinary words, ancient words, words that have outlasted every empire that tried to destroy the people who kept them. But just words. With the man, they become something else entirely. So that is where we begin. Isaiah is the second most quoted book in the entire New Testament. Only Psalms is cited more often. More than 400 direct references and allusions, woven through the words of Jesus, the letters of Paul, the Gospel of John, the book of Revelation. 400 times, the writers of the New Testament reached for this one book when they needed language large enough to hold what they were describing. But here is what most people do not know. Most people who have heard of Isaiah know a few sentences. They know comfort. Comfort, my people. They know by his wounds we are healed. They know the words, but they do not know the man. They do not know the city he loved and could not stop telling the truth about. They do not know the morning that changed everything. They do not know what it cost him to keep speaking for 60 years into a world that largely did not want to hear what he was saying. And without the man, the words float, beautiful, ancient, without roots, without the weight that comes from knowing who paid the price to speak them, and what that price actually was. So that is where we begin. Not with prophecy, not with fulfillment, with a man, in a city, in a century that was running out of time, and with the promise that we will come back to those 12 verses, because they are where everything in this story is going. Settle in. We are going back to the 8th century before Christ, back to Jerusalem, when it still believed in itself, back to the morning when a man walked into the temple and the ceiling opened. This is the complete story of Isaiah. Chapter 1. The Man Before the Prophet. We almost always make the same mistake with prophets. We read the words and forget the man who paid the price to speak them. We take the sentences out of the life they came from, polish them up, put them on walls and greeting cards and the covers of books. And in doing so, we make them safer than they were, easier to hold, less likely to disturb us the way they disturbed the people who first heard them spoken out loud by someone standing in front of them. In the street, in the daylight, with a name and a face and a family waiting at home. Isaiah was not a symbol. He was not a theological category. He was a man, and before we follow him into the temple on the morning that made him into something he could not have predicted, we need to spend some time with who he was before that morning, because the morning only makes sense if we understand the man it found. Isaiah was the son of a man named Amoz, not the prophet Amos, the shepherd from Tekoa who wrote the book that bears his name. A different man. Same name. The distinction matters because the tradition surrounding this particular Amoz is significant. The Talmud, in the tractate called Megillah, preserves a tradition that Amoz was the brother of King Amaziah of Judah. If that tradition is accurate, and serious scholars have held it at various levels of confidence for centuries, then Isaiah was not an outsider looking in at power. He was royalty adjacent. He was a man who could walk into the palace without being stopped, who knew the names of the people who made decisions that affected thousands, who understood from the inside how power works and what it costs the people who hold it. That matters, because the words Isaiah eventually spoke were not the words of someone describing a world he only glimpsed from a distance. They were the words of someone who had been in the room. He grew up in Jerusalem. Now we need to stop and let that settle. Jerusalem in the 8th century before Christ was not a ruin or a backwater. It was a city at the height of what it believed itself to be. The Temple of Solomon stood on the hill above the city, the most significant building in the religious imagination of an entire people. The place where heaven and earth were understood to touch. The city had walls. A functioning monarchy. Priests and scribes and merchants and soldiers and all the apparatus of a civilization that had decided it was permanent. And presiding over all of it, for most of Isaiah's early life, was a king named Uzziah. Uzziah reigned for 52 years. Let that number settle before you move past it. 52 years. Long enough for an entire generation to grow up knowing nothing else. Long enough for a young man born at the beginning of his reign to reach middle age and still be living under the same king. Long enough for stability to stop feeling like a gift and start feeling like the natural condition of things. The second book of Chronicles describes what Uzziah built across those decades. Towers along the walls, cisterns in the wilderness, agricultural projects, a reorganized military, by every external measure. He was a successful king in a prosperous nation, and that prosperity, accumulated across 5 decades, had done something to Jerusalem that prosperity always eventually does when it goes on long enough without interruption. It had made the city believe that it deserved what it had. Not grateful. Deserving. There is a difference. And it is the difference between a people who understand that what they have been given could be taken, and a people who have decided that what they have reflects something essential and permanent about who they are. Jerusalem, under the long reign of Uzziah, had crossed that line. The temple was full. The markets were active, and the city had slowly, without anyone quite deciding to, stopped connecting its well-being to the source of it. Isaiah grew up breathing that air. He was educated in it. He was formed by it. He was a man of words. And the quality of his Hebrew, even across the distance of translation and centuries, carries the mark of someone who had spent a lifetime understanding what language can hold and how to load it. He was connected to the palace and the temple and the centers of decision. And he loved Jerusalem. That last part matters more than almost anything else. Isaiah did not speak about his city the way a prosecuting attorney speaks about a defendant. He spoke about it the way a person speaks about something they love and cannot pretend not to see clearly. His first chapter reads like a medical report delivered by a physician who did not want to give the diagnosis but could not, in good conscience, withhold it. He was, before the morning in the temple, a man embedded in the life of his city, connected, informed, paying attention in the particular way that people pay attention when they love a place and are beginning to see something happening to it that they cannot name yet but cannot stop noticing. He had a wife. The text calls her the prophetess, which most scholars read simply as the wife of the prophet. He had sons, and what he did with those sons, the names he gave them, is one of the most revealing things about him as a man. He named his first son Shear-Jashub. In Hebrew, a remnant shall return. His second son, whose name is the longest in the entire Hebrew Bible, he named Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz, swift to the plunder, quick to the spoil. Think about what it means to give your child a name like that. Every time someone called that child in the marketplace, every time a neighbor greeted him on the street, they were speaking a prophetic statement. Isaiah was doing something that no speech or pamphlet could accomplish. He was putting his message into the mouths of people who did not even know they were carrying it. He was sending the word of God out into the streets of Jerusalem in the form of his own children. That is not the act of a man who is keeping a professional distance from his material. That is the act of a man who has decided that there is no version of his life that stands apart from the message he has been given. His children are the message. The line between his private life and his public calling does not exist. He was that kind of man. Before the temple, before the vision, before 60 years of speaking into a city that largely did not want to hear, and then Uzziah died. And Isaiah walked into the temple, and everything that came before was preparation for what was about to happen. Chapter 2. The City and Its Shadows. To understand what Isaiah saw when the ceiling opened, you first have to understand what he had been watching for years before that morning. Not the theology, the street level, what Jerusalem actually looked like and felt like to someone who loved it and could not stop paying attention to what was happening to it. Isaiah had been paying that kind of attention for years. And what he was watching, from the streets and from the palace-adjacent rooms where men like him had access, was a world changing in ways that the city preferred not to think about too carefully. He was approximately 15 years into his ministry when the reports started arriving in Jerusalem. Not rumors, specific reports, named cities, named populations. A man named Tiglath-Pileser III had seized the throne of Assyria and begun doing something the ancient world had not quite seen before. He did not simply conquer, he dismantled. He took entire populations, tens of thousands of people, and forcibly relocated them to distant parts of his empire, replacing them with settlers from other conquered regions who shared no history, no language, no memory with the land they were placed in. This was cultural annihilation executed at imperial scale, and it was working. Isaiah understood what those reports meant. He had the connections to read the intelligence clearly, and the disposition to read it honestly. While the political establishment in Jerusalem was processing the news in the way that political establishments process threatening information, by managing it, minimizing it, filing it in a category of things that might matter later but do not require action today, Isaiah was sitting with a different question. Not whether this was coming closer. It was. The question was what would be left standing when it arrived. And into this gathering pressure, with the shape of what was coming beginning to be visible to anyone paying honest attention, a king made a decision. His name was Ahaz. Ahaz was the son of Jotham, the grandson of Uzziah. He inherited the throne at a moment that would have tested any king, and he was not equal to the test. The crisis came quickly. A coalition formed between Syria and the northern kingdom of Israel two nations that should have been Judah's allies, who instead decided that Judah needed a new king, one who would cooperate with their political agenda. They marched toward Jerusalem. The text of Isaiah chapter 7 preserves a detail that is easy to move past, but should not be. When Ahaz heard about the coalition, his heart and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. Isaiah watched that happen, from close enough to feel the panic in the room, and he went to meet Ahaz at a public place, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool, on the road to the washer's field. He brought his son with him, Shear-Jashub. A remnant shall return, the child whose name was the message, walking beside his father in full view of anyone watching. Be careful, Isaiah said to the king. Be quiet. Do not fear. The threat will not succeed. Ask for a sign, any sign, from the depths of the earth to the heights of heaven, and it will be given as confirmation that what I am saying is true. Ahaz refused. He dressed the refusal in the language of piety. I will not put the Lord to the test, he said, as if hesitation were a form of reverence rather than what it actually was, which was the response of a man who had already made his decision and did not want a sign that might complicate it. Isaiah saw the decision being made in real time, and he could not stop it. Ahaz sent to Tiglath-Pileser III. He took silver and gold from the temple treasury, from the palace treasury, and sent it as a gift to the king of Assyria. Come help me. I am your servant. Isaiah stood in the street with his son, whose name meant a remnant shall return, and watched the king choose exactly the wrong thing. He gave the sign anyway, not to Ahaz, who had declined it, to something larger than this particular king in this particular moment of failure. He spoke into the air above the refusal, and what he spoke included a sentence that would be argued over for more than 2,000 years. We will spend a full chapter with that sentence, but for now, let us follow what happened next. The consequences of Ahaz's decision were not immediate. They rarely are. With decisions of this kind, the coalition did fail, as Isaiah had said it would. The arrangement with Assyria worked, in the narrow, short-term sense that political arrangements with powerful empires usually work until they don't. And then, in the year 722 before Christ, the thing that Isaiah had seen coming arrived at its first destination. Samaria fell. Samaria was the capital of the Israel-Gainer and the northern kingdom of Israel, 40 miles north of Jerusalem, close enough that the people of Jerusalem could encounter refugees from it on the road. The Assyrian king Sargon II besieged it, took it, and did what Assyrian kings did. More than 27,000 people were deported. According to his own records, settlers from other conquered regions were brought in. The identity, the culture, the particular way of being that had made the northern kingdom what it was deliberately and systematically erased. Isaiah had said this was coming. He had named the trajectory and described the destination. Jerusalem listened to the fall of Samaria and drew the wrong lesson. The wrong lesson was this. This is what happens to people who are not us. Samaria fell because Samaria was unfaithful. We are different. We have the temple. We have the line of David. We have the promises of God. What happened to them cannot happen to us. Isaiah was watching this reasoning take hold in real time. He could feel it forming in the conversations of the city, in the posture of the leadership, in the particular confidence that had settled back over Jerusalem after the immediate threat of the Syrian-Israeli coalition had passed. They had survived. Therefore, they were right to have done what they did to survive. That is the logic that convinces people who have stopped asking deeper questions. And Isaiah was walking through streets where that logic was operating, where the gap between what was being said in the temple and what was being done in the courts and the markets had grown so wide that it had stopped being hypocrisy, which, at least, requires a felt tension between profession and practice, and had become simply the way things were. His first chapter is a medical report from a physician who did not want to give the diagnosis. The whole head is sick. He writes, the whole heart is faint. From the sole of the foot to the head, there is no soundness. He goes on to describe specific injustice, specific failures, not vague spiritual decline, but the precise and particular wrong that has taken hold in a city convinced of its own righteousness. Widows not defended, orphans not protected, the poor pressed out of the courts by the people with the resources to press them. And all of it happening while the temple was full and the sacrifices were being offered on schedule, and the people continued to believe that the performance of religion was the same as the possession of relationship. I hate your festivals. The text says, your offerings mean nothing to me. Your hands are full of blood. Isaiah wrote those sentences in a city that did not want to hear them, about people who believed they were fine. That is not the work of someone keeping a professional distance from his material. That is the work of someone who loves a place enough to tell it the truth about itself, knowing that the truth will not be welcomed, knowing that the people he is telling it to have access to power and are not accustomed to being spoken to this way. He kept writing anyway. But the story was not only shadow. And it is important to say that before we go into the temple with Isaiah, in the next chapter, because in the landscape of political failure and street-level injustice and theological complacency that Isaiah was walking through, there was one person who would eventually hear differently. His name was Hezekiah. He was the son of Ahaz, and he had grown up watching his father make every wrong choice. He had seen what the arrangement with Assyria had actually produced. He had seen what Samaria had become. And somewhere in the watching, he had developed a response to what he witnessed that was the opposite of his father's. He believed, not in the casual, inherited, untested way that Ahaz had believed before the crisis came, in the particular way that comes from having seen what happens when the alternative is tried and found wanting. That mattered. We will come back to it. But first, we need to go to the temple. In the year that Uzziah died. Chapter 3. The year the ceiling opened. There are mornings that divide a life into before and after. Not because of what you decided on that morning. Not because of the quality of your preparation or the clarity of your faith when you walked out the door, but because of what arrived before you had a chance to decide anything at all. Because of what found you before you could find it. Isaiah chapter 6 is that kind of morning. And it begins. Before any vision, before any creature or fire or shaking threshold, with 4 words. In the year that King Uzziah died, we have already spent time with what those words mean historically. The 52 years, the leprosy in the temple, the isolation at the end, but there is something else in those 4 words that is worth sitting with before we go further. Uzziah was the fixed point. For most people alive in Jerusalem that year, he was the only king they had ever known. The world had organized itself around his presence the way a landscape organizes itself around a mountain. You navigation by it. You assume it will be there. Its permanence becomes part of your definition of permanence itself. And then he was gone. When a fixed point disappears, the question is not only political. It is the older, deeper question that loss of this kind always forces. If this thing that seemed permanent was not permanent, then what is? Isaiah walked into the temple in the year that question had no answer. We do not know exactly why he went. The text does not tell us. Perhaps it was for the mourning rituals. Perhaps because, in the absence of the stability that Uzziah's reign had represented, the temple was the only place that made sense to go. Perhaps he simply did not know where else to be on the day that the world, as he had known it, shifted beneath his feet. What we know is that he went, and what happened next has been read, studied, argued over, and returned to by serious people in every century since he wrote it down. I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Stop there. Not the throne, not the Lord on the throne. The train of his robe, the robe of the one sitting on the throne, extended so far that its hem alone filled the entire temple. The building that 7 years of construction with the finest materials the ancient world could produce had made the most significant structure in the religious imagination of an entire people. The building that sat at the center of everything Jerusalem understood about itself and its relationship to God. The hem of the robe filled it. That is the scale established in the opening sentence. And everything else in the chapter has to be understood inside that scale. Isaiah is not in a large room where something impressive is happening. He is standing at the edge of something so vast that what he can perceive of it is, by definition, the smallest possible portion. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. Seraphim. In Hebrew, the word means burning ones. These are not the gentle, winged figures of Renaissance painting. They are beings described by their burning. It is not something they do. It is what they are. And notice what they do with their wings. 4 of the 6 wings are not for flying. 2 cover the face. 2 cover what the ancient tradition understood as the most intimate and vulnerable aspects of physical existence. Only 2 wings are for movement. The beings who exist in the closest proximity to what Isaiah is glimpsing are covering themselves. Not because they are ashamed, because even they, beings constituted by fire and belonging to the realm of the divine, require a kind of protection from the full force of what sits on the throne above them, and they are calling to one another. Holy, Haul, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. 3 times. Not for rhythm, not to fill a line. In the grammar of ancient Hebrew, repetition of this kind is the superlative form. It is not saying God is the holiest among various holy things. It is reaching for a category that does not exist in ordinary language and constructing it through repetition. Holy in a way that makes the word holy, applied to anything else, feel like it is being used in quotation marks. The foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. The building moved. The permanent structure, the thing made of stone and timber and gold that was supposed to represent stability, was shaking, and smoke filled it. Not the decorative smoke of the priestly rituals that Isaiah knew from childhood, but the atmosphere of the presence itself. Now we come to Isaiah's response. And I said, "Woe is me, for I am lost." The word in Hebrew is stronger than most English translations render it. It is the word of doom, of complete undoing, of the recognition that something has ended that cannot be restarted. Isaiah is not being modest. He is not performing humility. He is reporting a reality. In the presence of what he is seeing, he has stopped functioning as a person capable of organized response. The faculties that make a human being able to think and speak and act have encountered something too large for those faculties to process. And then he names why. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Lips, not heart, not hands. Lips. He is a prophet. His instrument is language. His entire contribution to the world has been words, carefully chosen and intentionally constructed. And in this moment, in the presence of the one whose speech called existence itself into being, he is devastatingly aware of what his words have been and what they have not been. He is not confessing a specific sin. He is recognizing a category. The category of what human speech is in relation to the speech that made the world. Then the seraph moves. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. A burning coal, from the altar, carried not with hands but with tongs, because even the seraph mediates the contact. And he touched my mouth and said, "Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. This is not a gentle moment. A burning coal pressed against human lips is cauterization. It is the language of a wound being sealed by fire. A transformation accomplished not through gradual improvement, but through a single irreversible act. He has been remade, and it is only after that remaking that he hears something. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?" A conversation in the heavenly court, not addressed to Isaiah, happening in his presence. Between presences he cannot fully see. And Isaiah, the man who a moment ago could only say, "Woe is me," does something that no one prompted him to do. "Here I am. Send me." The most ancient phrase of availability in the Hebrew tradition. The phrase Abraham spoke before the binding of Isaac. The phrase Moses spoke at the burning bush. The phrase Samuel spoke in the night when the voice came to him in the temple at Shiloh. "Here I am." Not a claim of readiness. Not a statement of qualification. Simply the most complete form of availability that language can express. Whatever you are about to ask, I am in the position of someone who can be asked. And then the commission. Go and say to this people, keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Read that again. Slowly. The commission is not go and preach and they will listen. It is the strangest and most unsettling instruction in the entire prophetic literature of the Hebrew Bible. Go and speak, and your speaking will not produce understanding. Go and show, and your showing will not produce perception. Isaiah asks the only question that makes sense. How long, O Lord? And the answer is, until cities lie waste, without inhabitant. Until houses are without people. Until the land is a desolation. Until the forsaken places are many in the midst of the land. Until the thing that the trajectory requires has arrived. And then, at the very end, a word that is easy to miss because it comes after so much that is devastating. The holy seed is its stump. A tree cut down. And stumps do not mean the tree is finished. Stumps mean the tree was cut. The root system is still in the ground. What looks like an ending from above the surface may be something else entirely from below. Isaiah walked out of the temple that morning, carrying an impossible commission and a stubborn seed of something that refused to be called despair. He would spend 60 years carrying both. Now stay here one more moment before we follow him into those 60 years. Isaiah did not ask for this. He walked into the temple in a year of grief and destabilization and did not know what was about to happen. He did not enter with a prepared speech or a clear sense of vocation. He arrived as a man who had just lost the fixed point that had organized his world and did not know where else to go. And he left as someone for whom turning back was no longer an option. That is not a comfortable thing to sit with. The commission he received was not an honor in the way the world understands honor. It was 60 years of speaking truth into an audience that had been told in advance it would not fully receive it. And he said yes, before he knew what the saying yes would cost, before the 60 years had accumulated their weight, before the sons with strange names had grown up and the kings had risen and fallen, and the city he loved had moved through crisis after crisis toward the one it could not survive. He said yes in the year that Uzziah died. And that yes is the reason a scroll existed for a boy to find in a cave above the Dead Sea more than 27 centuries later. Chapter 4. The Weight of 60 Years. Isaiah chapter 6 is not the beginning of Isaiah's story. It is the moment his story becomes impossible to turn back from, the point after which every subsequent year is lived in the light, or the shadow, of what happened that morning in the temple. But the morning itself is not the story. The story is what a man does with 60 years after a morning like that. 60 years. Say it slowly. Let it settle before you move past it. 60 years of waking up and knowing what you were asked to do and going out and doing it into a world that was largely, persistently, sometimes aggressively uninterested in receiving it. 60 years of watching the people you loved choose the wrong things and being unable to stop them. 60 years of writing placards that were not going to be fully understood by the people who first heard them. Words aimed at something beyond the horizon of your own life. What does a man do with 60 years like that? We do not have a diary. We do not have letters. We do not have the kind of intimate personal record that would allow us to trace the interior life of Isaiah across the full span of his ministry. What we have is the book. And the book, read carefully, is itself a kind of record, not of what he felt. Exactly, but of what he kept doing regardless of what he felt. Let us follow him through the years. The first relationship that defines the shape of his ministry after the temple is the one we have already glimpsed. The relationship with Ahaz. We describe the meeting at the conduit of the upper pool. The offered sign. The refused sign. The sign given anyway. But there is something about the texture of Isaiah's engagement with Ahaz that deserves more time than the single famous encounter usually receives. Isaiah did not give up on Ahaz after the refusal. He kept speaking. Isaiah chapters 7 through 12, sometimes called the Book of Emmanuel by scholars, are a sustained body of material from the period of the Syrian-Israeli crisis and its aftermath. Chapter after chapter, Isaiah continues to address a situation that the king has already decided how to handle. He speaks into a decision that has been made. He describes consequences that are already in motion. He holds out the possibility of a different outcome for a nation that has already chosen the path toward the outcome he is describing. This is the particular kind of endurance his commission required, not the endurance of someone waiting for their moment to finally be heard. The endurance of someone who was told at the beginning that the hearing would be incomplete, and who chose to keep speaking anyway, because the speaking itself was the assignment. Consider what that costs over time. Most of us can absorb a single rejection without losing our sense of purpose. A door closes and we look for the next door. A conversation fails to land and we try again with different words. We can sustain a surprising amount of resistance if we believe that eventually, with enough patience or adjustment, we will find the opening. What Isaiah was doing was different. He was not looking for the adjustment that would finally make the message land. He had been told that the message was not going to land. Not fully. Not in the way that produces the change it describes. He was speaking because the speaking was commanded. Not because it was working by any external measure he could observe. That is not a posture that most people can maintain without becoming either numb or bitter. Isaiah did not become either. And the evidence is in the text. Because the material that comes out of the Ahaz years, the years of consistent non-reception, includes some of the most emotionally alive writing in the entire book. The grief in it is real. The longing is real. The strange, stubborn hope that persists in it despite everything he is watching is real in a way that cannot be manufactured or performed. He felt everything, and he kept going. Now let us look at what he did with his sons. We mentioned them briefly in the first chapter, but they deserve more time here. Before Isaiah gave his second son the name Maher-shalal-hash-baz, he did something that most readers move past without stopping. He wrote the name on a large tablet and had it witnessed. Two people of established reputation in Jerusalem, Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Jeberechiah, were called to sign their names to the document before the child was born. Think about what that means. Isaiah was not only a prophet in this moment, he was functioning like a notary. He was creating a public, witnessed, dated record of the name before the child arrived, so that when the child arrived and was given the name, no one could claim afterward that the name had been chosen retroactively to match events. He understood the problem of verification, and he took deliberate steps to address it. Not because he needed to convince himself, but because he was thinking about the people who would come after, the people who would need to know that the words preceded the events. That is the mind of a man who is writing for a horizon beyond his own lifetime. And then came the years that were different. Ahaz died. His son Hezekiah became king. We have already introduced Hezekiah as the contrast to his father. But the contrast runs deeper than a simple reversal of religious policy. Hezekiah had watched his father and the consequences of his father's choices, and he had arrived at a different conclusion about what it meant to be a king in the position Judah occupied in the world. The position was this: too small to dominate, too significant to ignore, surrounded by powers, any one of which could destroy it. The temptation for every king of Judah was to manage that position through clever alliance, through buying the protection of whatever empire happened to be most convenient at the moment. Ahaz had done exactly that, and it had worked, in the narrowest possible sense. For a time, Hezekiah looked at what it had actually produced and chose differently. When he took the throne, he began a series of reforms that 2 Chronicles describes in careful detail. He reopened the temple. He restored the regular worship. He called for a Passover that had not been properly observed in so long that there were not enough consecrated priests to conduct it, and he had to improvise. He prayed that God would accept the imperfect observance because the hearts of the people were genuine, even if the ritual preparation was not. That prayer tells you something important about Hezekiah. He was not a perfectionist about religion in the way that can make religion a tool for self-congratulation. He was willing to come with what he had, and he trusted Isaiah. That sentence deserves to stand alone. After years of Ahaz, after years of speaking to a king who had made his decisions before Isaiah arrived and was not in the market for a different perspective, Isaiah had a king who asked him things, who came to him in moments of genuine uncertainty, who treated the prophetic word as something that might actually change the outcome rather than something to be managed. For Isaiah, who had spoken into non-reception for so long that non-reception had become the baseline expectation, this must have been something close to disorienting. The material from the Hezekiah years reflects it, not in the sense that it becomes easier or less demanding, but in the sense that there is a quality of sustained engagement in it, a willingness to go deeper into the hardest questions, that comes from writing for someone who is actually reading. And then came Manasseh. Hezekiah died. His son, 12 years old when he became king, took the throne and began the reign that would last 55 years and undo everything his father had built. We will spend time with Manasseh in a later chapter, because his reign is the context in which Isaiah's life ended. But for now, let us note what the arc of those 4 reigns looks like from where Isaiah was standing. Uzziah, the fixed point, whose death opened the ceiling of the temple. Ahaz, who chose the wrong thing and could not be stopped. Hezekiah, who chose the right thing and whom Isaiah walked beside through the best years of his ministry. Manasseh, who systematically dismantled what Hezekiah had built and filled Jerusalem with innocent blood. 4 kings, 60 years, one man speaking through all of it. Not because every year produced visible fruit, not because the commission delivered on the promise of measurable impact, but because in the temple in the year Uzziah died, a man had said, "Here I am," and that yes was not conditional on the circumstances that followed. Here I am means here I am in the year the king died. Here I am in the years when Ahaz is not listening. Here I am when Hezekiah finally listens and the relationship I have been waiting for becomes real. Here I am when Manasseh takes the throne and everything begins to go backward. Here I am. Not here I am when the conditions are favorable. Not here I am when I can see the results. Not here I am when the city is moving in the right direction and the work is producing what work is supposed to produce. Here I am. That is what 60 years looks like from the inside. And it is the reason that the 12 verses in chapter 53, the verses we read about in the opening of this story, the verses that serious readers have been unable to set aside for 2,000 years, were written by a man whose credibility to write them came not from his theological training or his royal connections or his literary skill, though he had all 3. It came from 60 years of Here I Am. We will get to those 12 verses. We are on our way there. But first, we need to look at the specific moments that built the credibility. The specific encounters that shaped the man who eventually sat down and wrote words that a community would later hide in clay jars in a desert cave, because the words were worth more than their own survival. We begin with the name that has been argued over for more than 2,000 years. Chapter 5, The Impossible Name. There is a sentence in Isaiah chapter 7 that is 7 words in Hebrew. 7 words that have been argued over, translated and retranslated, debated in academic journals and seminary classrooms and late-night conversations between people who care deeply about getting it right. For more than 2,000 years. Not because the words are obscure, not because the grammar is unusually difficult, because reading them carefully forces a question that most people would rather approach slowly than answer quickly. So let us not rush. We are back at the conduit of the upper pool, back in the reign of Ahaz, back in the middle of the Syrian-Israeli coalition crisis, with 2 armies marching toward Jerusalem and a king shaking like a tree in a windstorm and a prophet walking out to meet him with a son whose name meant a remnant shall return. Isaiah has offered the sign. Any sign. From the depths of the earth to the heights of heaven. Ahaz has refused. Wrapping the refusal in the language of piety, while everyone in the conversation knows that what is actually driving it is a decision already made to send silver and gold to Tiglath-Pileser III. And Isaiah speaks anyway, not because the speech will change the decision. The decision has been made. But because what he is about to say is not primarily addressed to Ahaz. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. 7 words in Hebrew, and then a name. Now let us stay with the word that sits at the center of 2,000 years of argument. The Hebrew word Isaiah uses is Alma. It appears 9 times in the entire Hebrew Bible. In every case, its usage refers to a young woman of marriageable age, a woman who is young, who is in the period of life between childhood and established marriage. The word carries a strong cultural implication of sexual purity, in the sense that a young unmarried woman in the ancient Near Eastern context would have been expected to be a virgin. But the word itself is a social category, rather than a biological definition. The Hebrew word that most precisely corresponds to what modern English means by virgin, in the specific biological sense of someone who has never had sexual intercourse, is Bethulah. Isaiah did not use Bethulah. He used Alma. This distinction has been the foundation of centuries of argument. Jewish scholars, particularly after the 1st century of the Common Era, have consistently argued that Alma simply means young woman, and that the sign Isaiah was offering Ahaz was a sign locatable in the immediate historical situation. A young woman known to Ahaz, perhaps the wife of Isaiah himself, would conceive and bear a son, and by the time that child reached a certain age, the political threat would be resolved. That is a serious reading. It deserves to be taken seriously. But the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures produced by Jewish scholars in Alexandria in the 3rd and 2nd centuries before Christ, rendered Alma with the Greek word parthenos. And parthenos does carry the specific biological meaning, virgin in the precise sense. That translation decision, made by Jewish scholars before there was any Christian interest in what the word should mean, is significant in ways that are difficult to dismiss. Here is what both sides of the argument sometimes miss. The sign that Isaiah announces does not fully exhaust its meaning in the immediate political situation. Whatever child was born in the years immediately following the conversation at the conduit of the upper pool, the language Isaiah uses exceeds the demands of the moment in ways the text itself makes clear. Because the name, Emmanuel, in Hebrew, Immanuel, God with us, not God watching us, not God aware of our situation from a careful distance, God with us. The preposition carries the force of presence, of accompaniment, of the kind of being, alongside, that changes the nature of what you are alongside. Now ask yourself a simple question. What king in the history of Israel was ever given this name at birth, in a way that the name was intended as literal description rather than aspirational poetry? The answer is none. No ruler in the Davidic line bore this name in the sense its theology requires. Which means the sign Isaiah speaks points towards something the immediate historical situation cannot fully contain. This is what scholars call a double fulfillment pattern. A prophecy addresses an immediate situation with language that is adequate to that situation but not exhausted by it. The immediate situation provides an initial fulfillment, but the language, chosen with a precision that exceeds the requirements of the moment, points beyond the immediate to something further, something the full force of the language was always aimed at. Matthew understood this. When he arrives at the birth of Jesus, at the account of Mary and the angel and Joseph's dream and the extraordinary circumstances of the conception, the language he reaches for is Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. Matthew is not saying here is a prophecy now checked off a list. He is saying, here is a language that was always aimed beyond its immediate target, and we are now standing at the further target it was aimed at. Stand in Matthew's position for a moment. He is a Jewish man writing for Jewish readers. He knows his Hebrew Bible the way a trained musician knows scales. He is not searching for texts to make fit. He is reading the story unfolding in front of him and reaching for the language large enough to hold it. And the language large enough, the only language large enough for what he is witnessing, was written 700 years before the event. He is trying to describe God with us, not as a title of honor, not as a poetic expression of divine care, as a description of what is actually happening when a specific child is born under specific circumstances that the prophet whose words Matthew is quoting described with a precision that a purely human vantage point cannot easily account for. That is the sentence. 7 words in Hebrew, argued over for more than 2,000 years. And the argument, which has not been resolved and is unlikely to be resolved in these pages, may itself be the most interesting evidence that the sentence means something no argument made about it has yet fully contained. Immanuel, God with us. The name floated in the tradition for 700 years, attached to a sign given in the reign of a frightened king who had already decided he was not listening. And then it found its address. Chapter 6. The Land of Darkness and the Child Who Changes Everything. There is a logic to how empires humiliate. They do not start with the center. They do not march first on the capital, the temple, the seat of power and religious identity. They start with the edges, the places that are already a little forgotten, already a little expendable, where people have always known in the quiet way that peripheral people know things that they are not the priority, that when decisions are made about who matters, they will be considered last. If you want to break a nation, you bleed the edges until the heart beats alone in an empty body. Tiglath-Pileser III understood this. When Assyria moved against Israel in the year 733 before Christ, it did not begin with Jerusalem. It did not begin with Samaria. It began in the north, in the territories of Zebulun and Naphtali, the tribal regions that hugged the western shore of the Sea of Galilee and spread into the mixed, border-crossing, ethnically complicated land that later generations would call Galilee of the Gentiles. These were the first people taken, the first populations displaced, the first communities to experience what Assyrian conquest meant at the level of a family, a village, a shared way of life dissolved by the machinery of imperial policy. And they were the people that Jerusalem looked down on a little. That is the part that requires honesty to acknowledge. Galilee in the 8th century before Christ was not the prestigious address. It was the region where the ethnic boundaries were blurrier, where the Israelite population had been living alongside non-Israelite neighbors for generations, where the purity of lineage and practice that Jerusalem used as a marker of standing was harder to establish and easier to question. So when Assyria came and took Zebulun and Naphtali first, there may have been in certain corners of Jerusalem a reaction that was not entirely grief, a quiet, ugly, unacknowledged relief. Not us, not the temple and the palace and the line of David. Them, the people who were always a little less central, a little less pure, a little more peripheral. Isaiah knew that reaction. He had walked through the city long enough to know exactly how it processed the suffering of people it had already decided were less important. And he wrote directly into it. But there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. Read that in its historical context. Read it as someone who has just watched Zebulun and Naphtali lose their population to Assyrian deportation, who has seen families torn from land their ancestors held for generations, who has watched the particular devastation of a people being deliberately unmade as a people, and then read what Isaiah says about that devastated, humiliated, peripheral land. He does not say they will be restored to what they were. He does not say their former glory will return. He says something that in the context of the 8th century before Christ is almost incomprehensible. The land that was humiliated first will be made glorious first. Not Jerusalem, not the Temple Mount, not the seat of Davidic kingship and the center of the religious life of the nation. Galilee, the peripheral place, the edge place, the place Jerusalem used as a contrast when it wanted to feel central. That is where the light arrives first. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. Now hold that image and do not rush past it. The people in darkness are not being described as people who earned their darkness through moral failure. They are simply people who are in it, who have been sitting in it, who have, by the time the light arrives, been sitting in it long enough that the darkness has become the definition of their experience. And the light does not wait for them to find their way out first. It does not shine at the exit and ask them to walk toward it. It shines on them, where they are, in the middle of the darkness that has been their address. That is a theological statement dressed in the language of geography. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. 4 names. We need to spend time with each of them, not because they are decorative, because they are theological statements. And each one carries a weight that the ancient world would have recognized immediately as exceeding anything applicable to an ordinary king. The first name is Wonderful Counselor. In Hebrew, Pelejoes. The word translated as wonderful here is the same word used elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible for acts that are miraculous, supernatural, beyond the capacity of human explanation, not wonderful in the modern English sense of admirable, wonderful in the original sense of belonging to the category of wonders, of things that cannot be accounted for by ordinary means. The counsel of this child is not the counsel of a wise man who has studied carefully and thought deeply. It is counsel of a different order, from a source of knowledge not bounded by the limits that bound human knowledge. No king in the history of Israel was ever called this in the sense the name requires. The second name is Mighty God. In Hebrew, El Gibor. Stop there. El is not a title of honor. El is a name. It is one of the primary names of God in the Hebrew Bible. The God who created the heavens and the earth is called El. Isaiah names this child El Gibor, not a mighty servant of God, not a powerful representative of God. Mighty God. In the theological world of the Hebrew Bible, where the absolute uniqueness of the God of Israel is the foundational claim of everything, giving a human child the name El is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a statement that demands to be reckoned with on its own terms. The third name is Everlasting Father. In Hebrew, Aviyad, the Father of eternity, not a father who rules for a long time. A father whose relationship to time itself is not bounded the way the relationship of every other father in human history is bounded. Every human being who has ever been called father has been called father within the constraints of a human lifespan. This is something different. The fourth name is Prince of Peace. In Hebrew, Sar Shalom, and Shalom is one of the most theologically loaded words in the entire Hebrew Bible. It is not simply the absence of conflict. It is the presence of wholeness, the state in which everything designed to be in relationship is in right relationship, where nothing is broken that should be whole, where the created order is functioning as it was created to function before the fractures began. The Sar Shalom is not someone who negotiates an end to a particular war. He is the one who brings about the condition in which the root cause of all war has been healed. No political leader in human history has achieved that. 4 names, none of them applicable to any human king who has ever lived. All of them given by Isaiah to a child born to people sitting in darkness in a piece of geography that Jerusalem had already written off as peripheral. Now let us come forward 800 years. Matthew, the Jewish author writing for Jewish readers, tells the story of Jesus leaving Nazareth after John the Baptist has been arrested. Jesus goes to live in Capernaum, and Matthew pauses. He notes the geography. Capernaum was in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali. And then he quotes Isaiah chapter 9. The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light. And for those dwelling in the region and shadow of death, on them a light has dawned. Matthew is not constructing an argument. He is not producing evidence for a legal case. He is doing what people do when something they see makes them reach involuntarily for the language large enough to hold it. He is saying, I know where I have seen this before. I know whose words were already aimed at this place. I know who said that Galilee of the nations, the peripheral place, the humiliated place, the place the center ignores, was where the light would come first. And I am standing in the place he was talking about. But here is what I want to end this chapter with, because it is the thing about Isaiah chapter 9 that is most easily missed in the theological discussion of the names and the geography. Isaiah does not say the people in darkness will eventually find their way to the light. He says the light comes to them. That is not a small distinction. In the dominant religious framework of the ancient world, as in much of our own, spiritual progress was understood as movement. You do the right things. You travel in the right direction. And if you travel faithfully enough and far enough, you arrive at the blessing waiting at the destination. The darkness is your starting point. The light is your goal. And the distance between them is measured in the quality of your movement toward it. Isaiah is not describing that framework. He is describing a framework in which the light moves, in which the destination comes to find the people at the starting point, in which the qualification for receiving the light is not having successfully navigated your way out of the darkness, but simply having been in the darkness when the light arrived. On them has light shone. That is the claim, and it is a claim that does not primarily concern geography or historical verification. It is a claim about the direction of grace. It moves toward the darkness. It arrives at the peripheral places. It chooses Galilee. And 800 years after Isaiah named that choice, a man from Nazareth began his public ministry in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, in a fishing village on the shore of a lake, among people who worked with their hands and had no particular religious prestige and were not the people that Jerusalem would have chosen as the first recipients of anything important, because that is the direction grace moves. Not toward the center, toward the edges, not toward those who are already standing in the light, toward the ones sitting in the dark. Chapter 7. The Hinge, Hezekiah and the Two Prayers. In the middle of all the prophecy, there is a story, not a vision, not a poem, not the kind of elevated literary construction that makes up most of the book of Isaiah and that requires sustained attention to follow. Just a story, with a beginning and a middle and an end, with a king and a prophet and a crisis and a prayer and an outcome that nobody predicted. A story that sits at the exact center of the book, structurally and theologically, and functions the way a hinge functions on a door. Everything before it swings on it. Everything after it swings on it. Remove it, and the two halves of the book do not connect. The story of Hezekiah is the hinge on which Isaiah turns, and it begins not with Hezekiah's greatest moment, but with Jerusalem surrounded. Though Jern was approximately 701 before Christ, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, had moved his army into Judah. The records we have, both from the Hebrew Bible and from Sennacherib's own annals, discovered by archaeologists, agree on the basic facts. He came. He was effective. He took city after city in the Judean lowlands, 46 of them, according to his own account, and he arrived at Jerusalem and put it under siege. Now let us understand what this meant in practical terms, because the historical distance can make it feel abstract in a way that the people living through it would have found incomprehensible. 46 cities. Sennacherib did not simply occupy these places. He destroyed them. The archaeological record of Lachish, the second most important city in Judah after Jerusalem, which fell during this campaign, has been extensively excavated. The destruction layer is unmistakable. The evidence of siege warfare, of mass killing, of the systematic dismantling of an urban population, is written into the earth in a way that does not require interpretation. Sennacherib had reliefs carved into the walls of his palace in Nineveh, depicting the siege and fall of Lachish in extraordinary detail. Soldiers with siege ramps and battering rams, defenders falling from the walls, prisoners marched away in lines. The king of Assyria seated on a throne outside the captured city receiving tribute. These things happened. They were recorded by the people who did them as occasions for pride. And the army that had done them was now camped outside Jerusalem. Then Sennacherib sent a delegation. A high official called the Rabshakeh stood outside the walls of Jerusalem and delivered a message. He delivered it not in Aramaic, the diplomatic language of the ancient Near East, but in Hebrew, deliberately, so that the soldiers on the walls could hear and understand every word. The message was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. "Do not let Hezekiah deceive you," the Rabshakeh said. "Do not let him tell you that God will deliver you, because no God has delivered any nation from Assyria." He went through the list. Hamath, Arpad, Sepharvaim, every nation that had trusted in divine protection and found it insufficient, every god that had failed to prevent what the Assyrian army came to accomplish. Has any god of any nation ever delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? It was not a crude threat. It was a theological argument. The claim that the evidence of history demonstrates that divine protection is not a real category of human experience. That the pattern of what actually happens when armies march is not interrupted by the prayers of the people being marched on. Regardless of which god those prayers are addressed to, the officials of Hezekiah asked the Rabshakeh to speak in Aramaic rather than Hebrew, so the soldiers on the wall would not hear. The Rabshakeh refused. That was precisely the point. The delegation returned to Hezekiah, and Hezekiah did something that his father Ahaz, in a moment of crisis, had refused to do. He went to the temple. He tore his clothes, which in the ancient Near Eastern tradition was the physical expression of grief that had passed the point where ordinary composure could contain it. He put on sackcloth. and he sent to Isaiah. This is a day of distress, of rebuke, and of disgrace. The message said, Children have come to the point of birth, and there is no strength to bring them forth. That last image is one of the most precise in the entire book. Children at the point of birth and no strength to bring them forth. The moment that has been building toward its crisis has arrived at the point of decision, and the strength to push through it is not there. Isaiah's response was immediate. Do not be afraid because of the words you have heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have reviled me. Behold, I will put a spirit in him, so that he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will make him fall by the sword in his own land. Do not be afraid. The same words that the seraph spoke in the temple when Isaiah fell on his face. The same words that appear at the most significant moments of divine encounter throughout the Hebrew Bible, not because there is nothing frightening, but because the source of the fear is not the final word on the situation. Hezekiah received the message, and then Sennacherib sent a letter. The letter was a written version of what the Rabshakeh had said out loud. The gods of the nations have not saved them. You will not be saved. Do not let your God deceive you. And Hezekiah took the letter and went up to the temple, and he spread it out before the Lord. This is one of the most human moments in the entire Hebrew Bible. A king, facing a threat he cannot match with the resources available to him, takes the written evidence of that threat and places it in front of God, not as a formal liturgical act, as a man who has run out of other options and is doing the only thing left to do. Here it is. You can read it. This is what we are facing. This is what they are saying about you and about us. I do not have an answer to this. I am bringing it to you. And then he prays. The prayer of Hezekiah does not argue. It does not construct a theological case for why God should intervene. It does not offer a transaction, a promise of future faithfulness in exchange for present rescue. It begins with acknowledgement. You are the God, you alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. You made the heavens and the earth. It situates the crisis inside a framework of who God is before it makes any request at all. Then it states the situation honestly. Sennacherib has come. He has laid waste nations. He has thrown their gods into the fire. And here is why that matters. Those gods were not gods. They were wood and stone, the work of human hands. Of course they could be burned. They were always only objects. The God of Israel is different in kind, not merely in power. And then, the request. Save us, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are the Lord. The purpose of the rescue is not the comfort of Hezekiah. It is not the survival of Jerusalem as an end in itself. It is the demonstration, to everyone watching, of what is actually true about the nature of reality. Isaiah received the word before Hezekiah had finished praying. He shall not come into this city or shoot an arrow there, or come before it with a shield, or cast up a siege mound against it. By the way that he came, by the same he shall return, and he shall not come into this city, declares the Lord. Not a single arrow. The army that had taken 46 cities of Judah, that had carved its victory over Lachish in stone on the walls of a palace in Nineveh, that was camped outside Jerusalem's gates and had delivered a theological argument for the futility of prayer, was not going to fire a single arrow at the walls. It was standing outside. And then the text says something that has been debated by historians and archaeologists and theologians ever since. And the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when people arose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies, 185,000 soldiers, dead in their camp in a single night. Sennacherib returned to Nineveh. He did not take Jerusalem. He never returned to Judah, his own inscriptions, which boast of everything else he accomplished in this campaign, are notably silent about the outcome of the Jerusalem siege. saying only that he shut Hezekiah up like a bird in a cage without claiming to have captured the cage. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing more than 2 centuries later, preserves a version of a catastrophic loss in the Assyrian army during this period. His version attributes it to field mice eating the soldiers' equipment. The specific detail differs. The memory of a catastrophic event survives in a second independent tradition. What Isaiah said would happen, happened. Not a single arrow was fired at the walls of Jerusalem. Sennacherib went home. He was killed in his own land, in the temple of his own God, by his own sons, exactly as Isaiah had said. Now let us move to the second prayer, because the story of Hezekiah is not one crisis but 2, and the second is in some ways more important than the first. Sometime after the Assyrian siege, Hezekiah became ill. The text does not specify the illness. It says only that he was sick to the point of death, and Isaiah came to him. Not with comfort, not with a word of encouragement, with a sentence, "Set your house in order, for you shall die. You shall not recover." 5 words. Direct, without qualification, without the softening that human compassion almost always inserts between the speaker and the hardest truth being spoken. Isaiah turned and left. He had said what he was sent to say. He walked out of the room with the sentence still in the air. And Hezekiah turned his face to the wall. That detail has stayed in the consciousness of readers for 3,000 years. He did not compose himself. He did not organize his theological convictions into a posture of dignified acceptance. He turned his face away from the room, from whatever audience a king always has, toward the wall, and he wept. No prayer is recorded in the formal sense. We do not have the words he said. If he said words, what we have is the posture, turned away, weeping, and then speaking to God with the only thing he had available in that moment. Remember, O Lord, I beg you, how I have walked before you in faithfulness and with a whole heart, and have done what is good in your sight. It is not a claim of perfection. It is not an argument for why he deserves more time. It is the simplest possible statement of a relationship. I have tried to be faithful to you. I am asking you to remember that. Isaiah had not yet reached the middle court, the transitional space between the inner chambers and the outer area of the palace, when the word came to him, "Turn back, go and tell Hezekiah. Thus says the Lord, the God of David your father, I have heard your prayer. I have seen your tears. I will add 15 years to your life." 15 years. Not a metaphor. Not a promise of continued spiritual significance or legacy. 15 additional years of biological life. And as a sign, the shadow on the sundial of Ahaz moved backward 10 steps. The measurement of time itself reversed its direction. Time went backward. The prophet who said, "You shall die," came back and said, "You shall live." Both things were true. Both things were the word of God. Not because God changed his mind under pressure, but because the space between the first word and the second word was the space in which a king turned his face to the wall and wept. And that space was not empty. Now let us hold both stories together and ask what they are doing at the center of this book. A man surrounded by an overwhelming force. A prayer that spreads the evidence of the threat before God and simply says, "Look at this. I have nothing else." An outcome that defies every reasonable expectation. A man told he will die. A prayer that offers nothing except the truth of a relationship. An outcome in which the trajectory is reversed and 15 years are added to a life that was ending. These stories are placed at the center of Isaiah, not to demonstrate prophetic accuracy. They are placed here because what Hezekiah experienced on a personal scale is the pattern that Isaiah chapter 40 through 66 applies at the scale of an entire people. The exile that is coming is not the end. The death sentence that history seems to be pronouncing is not the final word. The trajectory of a civilization moving toward judgment is not a trajectory that cannot be interrupted by the same God who heard a king weeping with his face to a wall. And more than that, Hezekiah is a man who received a death sentence, prayed with everything he had, and was given life back. That pattern, written into the personal biography of one king in the 8th century before Christ, is the same pattern that Isaiah chapter 53 will describe at a level that reaches beyond any individual biography. Someone will carry what the rest of us cannot carry. Someone will absorb the sentence that we have accumulated. And on the other side of that carrying, what was pronounced over us does not get to be the final word. Hezekiah is not the fulfillment of that pattern. He is the preview of it. A man with his face to the wall. A prayer with no argument in it. 15 years added to a life that was ending. And a prophet who walked back into the room with a different word than the one he left with. That is the hinge. Everything in the first half of Isaiah leads here. Everything in the second half grows from here. And the 12 verses we have been moving toward since the opening of this story. The 12 verses about someone pierced for the transgressions of others. About a grave with the wicked and a rich man. About days prolonged after the cutting off. Those verses begin to make a different kind of sense when you have first stood in the room with Hezekiah. When you have watched a man turn his face to the wall and heard a prophet come back with a different word. When you understand that in the world of Isaiah, death sentences are not always the last sentence. Chapter 8. The Shift. Comfort. Comfort my people. At chapter 40, the book breathes differently. Not softer. Exactly. The material in the second half of Isaiah is not less demanding than the first half. It does not retreat from the hard things into something easier to hold. But the altitude has changed. Where the first 39 chapters were often at street level, in the specific heat of specific political crises, with specific kings making specific wrong choices, chapter 40, and everything that follows is operating from a different vantage point. As if the book has climbed to a height where the individual events of the first half are still visible, but now they can be seen as part of a larger shape, a longer arc, a story that does not end where it appeared to be ending. 3 words open it. Comfort. Comfort my people. In Hebrew, nachamu. Nachamu. Ami. The repetition is not accidental. In the prophetic tradition, repetition of this kind is emphasis. But it is also something else. It is the sound of someone saying something twice, because once is not enough to convey the full weight of what is being offered. Comfort. No. Truly. Comfort. Not a small comfort. Not a provisional comfort. Not a comfort that arrives with conditions still attached. Comfort. After 39 chapters, let us hold the weight of that transition. The first 39 chapters of Isaiah are not uniformly dark. There are passages of extraordinary beauty and hope woven through them. But the dominant note, the sustained sound underneath everything, is the sound of a prophet watching a people move toward consequences they cannot avoid and being unable to prevent the movement. The cities laid waste. The land becoming desolate. The people removed far away. That was the word Isaiah received in the temple on the year Uzziah died. And the first 39 chapters are the unfolding of that word in real time. And then, comfort, says your God. The possessive matters, not comfort, says God in the abstract. Not comfort, says the divine force that governs the universe with appropriate impartiality. Your God, the God who made covenant with you, the God who is in particular relationship with you, the God who has not dissolved the relationship simply because the people who are a party to it have behaved in ways that damaged it. Your God says comfort. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem, and cry to her that her warfare is ended, that her iniquity is pardoned, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. Her warfare is ended. Her iniquity is pardoned. These are not predictions of what will eventually happen after sufficient punishment has been administered. They are proclamations, declarations made over a situation that has not yet resolved itself historically. The pardon is spoken before the sentence is fully served. The comfort is offered before the crisis is over. That is the theological grammar of Isaiah 40, not the grammar of an accountant calculating when the debt will be paid. The grammar of someone who has the authority to declare the debt resolved and who is exercising that authority before the calculation is complete. Now, we need to address the question that serious readers of Isaiah have been debating for centuries, because it bears directly on everything this chapter is trying to say. Did Isaiah of Jerusalem, the man who received the vision in the temple in the year Uzziah died, write the second half of this book? Or did someone else, writing from the context of the Babylonian exile that came more than a century after Isaiah's death, produce chapters 40 through 66? This is not a question invented by people who want to undermine the authority of the text. It emerges from careful attention to the text itself. The voice changes at chapter 40. The historical references shift from the Assyrian period to the Babylonian period. And most significantly, Cyrus, the king of Persia, is named directly as the one who will authorize the return of the Jewish exiles from Babylon. Cyrus, who would not be born for more than a century after the death of Isaiah. Those who argue for a later author point to these features as evidence that the second half of the book reflects a different historical situation, written from inside the exile rather than from a vantage point before it. Those who argue for the unity of the book point to the ancient manuscript tradition, to the testimony of the New Testament, which consistently quotes both halves as the work of a single prophet, and to the theological significance of a book written before the exile to prepare a people for an exile they would not experience for another century. We will engage the question of Cyrus more fully in the next chapter. But here, in the context of chapter 40, the important point is this. Whether you read the second half of Isaiah as the work of the 8th century prophet writing about a future he could see from the vantage point of the temple vision, or as the work of a later prophet writing from inside the exile, the theological content of chapter 40 is the same. A word of comfort spoken over a situation of suffering, a declaration of pardon over accumulated guilt, a promise of return into an experience of displacement. And both readings agree on this. The comfort came before the crisis was over. The word arrived before the situation resolved. The declaration preceded the historical fulfillment. That is the grammar of the text regardless of when it was written. A voice cries, "In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God." This is the sentence that John the Baptist quoted to describe himself. He was standing in the wilderness of Judea, baptizing in the Jordan River. And when people asked who he was and what authority he had for what he was doing, he answered them with this sentence from Isaiah 40. I am the voice that Isaiah heard crying in the wilderness, the one preparing the way. Now let us think carefully about what it means for a first-century Jewish man to read an ancient text and conclude that the text is describing him. John was not saying, "This text predicted that someone like me would come, and I am a reasonable fulfillment of the general category it predicted." He was saying something much more specific and much more personal. This is my biography. The text that Isaiah wrote, whatever Isaiah was thinking when he wrote it, is a description of the particular role I am playing in the particular moment I am living in. The voice in the wilderness is not a metaphor for John. The wilderness is not a metaphor. The preparation of a way is not a metaphor. He understood himself to be the literal fulfillment of a literal sentence that Isaiah spoke into a situation that was, historically speaking, completely different from John's situation, but that had always been aimed at this moment. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. In the original context, this is the language of royal procession. When a great king was going to travel through territory, road crews went ahead to prepare the route. Hills were graded, Valleys were filled. The physical landscape was adjusted to make the progress of the king smooth and unimpeded. Isaiah is using this image to describe the preparation of conditions so that what God is doing can reach the people it is intended to reach without obstruction. John understood himself as the road crew, not the king, not the arrival. The preparation for the arrival. And his preparation was not architectural. It was the work of calling people to honesty about themselves, to the kind of acknowledgement that creates interior space into which something larger than the current self can arrive. After me comes he who is mightier than I, the strap of whose sandals I am not worthy to stoop down and untie. John's self-understanding, his clarity about the precise boundary between his role and the role of the one coming after him, was itself an act of the preparation he was describing. He was not overreaching. He was doing exactly what the voice in Isaiah 40 was doing. Preparing, announcing, pointing. Now let us stay with something about Isaiah 40 that is easy to miss in the theological discussions. The chapter does not begin with argument. It does not begin with explanation or evidence or the construction of a case for why God is trustworthy. It begins with a word addressed to people who are suffering. Comfort. Comfort my people. The people to whom this word is addressed are people who have experienced or are about to experience the loss of everything they thought was permanent. The city, the temple, the land, the identity organized around the possession of those things. And the first word to them is, not here is why this happened. Not here is what you did wrong. Not here is the theological framework within which your suffering makes sense. The first word is comfort. That is a choice. A specific, deliberate choice about what the most important thing to say to suffering people is. Not explanation. Not correction. Not the theological framework within which their suffering makes sense. Comfort. And then, from that foundation, from the establishment of comfort as the ground rather than the destination, the chapter unfolds what follows from that comfort. Who God is. What God's capacity is relative to the things that seem impossible. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might he increases strength. Not to the people who have already demonstrated their strength. Not to the people whose resilience has proven their worthiness for additional resource. To the faint, to the person who has no might. Even youths shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. This is the closing movement of one of the most carefully constructed chapters in the Hebrew Bible. And notice where it ends. Not with the dramatic image, not with the eagles and the running. They shall walk and not faint. Walking is the ordinary movement. It is not the movement of special occasions or peak experiences, or the moments when faith feels like it is producing visible results. Walking is what you do on Tuesday afternoon when nothing is happening, and the distance between where you are and where you are going is as large as it was on Monday and will be on Wednesday. They who wait for the Lord shall walk and not faint. That is the promise. Not that the waiting will be short, not that the ordinary days will feel extraordinary, but that the strength required to keep walking through the ordinary days will be present when it is needed. Isaiah chapter 40 is not addressed to people who are doing well. It is addressed to people who are faint, who have no might, who are on the edge of exhaustion in the particular way that sustained suffering produces exhaustion. And the word to them is not shape up, not try harder. Not here is the theological framework that explains why this is happening. Wait. Keep walking. The strength will be there. The voice that cries in the wilderness is not announcing the end of the wilderness. It is announcing the arrival of something into the wilderness that changes what the wilderness means. Not the removal of the difficult thing, but a presence in the middle of it that is larger than the difficult thing. Comfort. Comfort my people, says your God. Chapter 9. the passage that defies category. There is a passage in the Hebrew Bible that serious readers have been unable to simply set aside for more than 2,000 years. Not because it is obscure, not because the language is unusually difficult or the imagery unusually ambiguous, but because it is specific in ways that specificity should not allow, because it describes something with a precision that makes the ordinary explanations feel inadequate in proportion to how carefully you read it. We mentioned it at the beginning of this story. 12 verses, written at least 100 years before Jesus of Nazareth was born, describing someone pierced for the transgressions of others, someone silent like a lamb led to slaughter, someone who makes his grave with the wicked and with a rich man, someone whose days are prolonged after being cut off from the land of the living. We said we would get there. We are there. The passage begins at Isaiah chapter 52, verse 13, and runs through the end of chapter 53, and we are going to read it the way it deserves to be read. Slowly, without rushing toward the conclusion, staying with each image long enough to feel the specific weight it carries before moving to the next one. Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up, and shall be exalted. The opening is not what you expect from a passage about suffering. It begins with exaltation. High and lifted up is the same language used in Isaiah chapter 6 to describe God on the throne. The servant is, at the beginning, placed in the category of the exalted, and then immediately, without transition, without explanation of how these two things belong together. As many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred, beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. The exaltation and the disfigurement placed side by side. The one who will be high and lifted up is also the one whose appearance has been altered beyond what human appearance normally allows. Beyond human semblance. Not merely damaged, changed to the point where the category of human appearance no longer adequately describes what is visible. He shall sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which has not been told them they shall see, and that which they have not heard they shall understand. Kings shutting their mouths, not in contempt, in the particular silence that comes when something is witnessed that exceeds the capacity of language to address, the silence of comprehension arriving before words can form. Now chapter 53. Who has believed what he has heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? The chapter opens with a question that acknowledges its own difficulty. This is not a report of something that everyone immediately recognizes and accepts. It is the account of something that required a particular kind of reception, a willingness to believe what was being heard that was not universally present in those who heard it. For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. A root out of dry ground. Something that should not be able to grow, that has no natural basis for its existence in the conditions surrounding it. And that grows anyway. Not because the soil is favorable, because what is in the root is stronger than the hostility of the ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. This is the opposite of what the ancient world expected from its significant figures. Kings in the ancient Near East were described in terms of physical magnificence. Significance and physical impressiveness were understood to correlate. The servant has neither. There is nothing in his appearance that would cause the eye to stop and take notice. He is, by the visible markers the ancient world used to identify importance, unremarkable. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Despised, rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. The word translated as acquainted suggests intimate familiarity. The grief is not something this person encounters occasionally and manages. It is something they know from the inside. The way you know a room you have spent years living in. And then the pivot that makes this passage unlike anything else in the Hebrew Bible. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. The shift from his to our changes everything. Up to this point, the suffering described has been the servant's own. His appearance was marred. He was despised and rejected. He was acquainted with grief. But now the text does something almost violent in its abruptness. It relocates the origin of the suffering. Our griefs, our sorrows. What the servant is carrying is not his. It was ours first, and the people watching, the we of the passage, made the assumption that suffering of this magnitude must indicate divine punishment. Stricken by God, afflicted, they looked at his suffering and read it as evidence of his guilt. They were wrong, but he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. Pierced, crushed. These are not metaphors for disappointment or social exclusion. These are words that describe physical violence of a specific kind. Pierced is the word for what happens to a body when something sharp passes through it. Crushed is the word for what happens under extreme weight or force. And the purpose of the piercing and the crushing is stated with a directness the text does not soften. For our transgressions, for our iniquities. The structure of what is happening here is substitution. Something owed by us is being paid by him. The chastisement, the corrective suffering that the accumulated weight of transgressions requires, falls on the servant rather than on the ones who accumulated it. And the result of that transfer, the peace and the healing announced in the last line, flows back to those from whom it came. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned, everyone, to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. The universality of the first two lines is matched by the singularity of the last one. All have gone astray. Every one has turned to his own way. There is no category of exception, no subset of humanity that has maintained its orientation while the rest drifted, and the response to the all is the laying on, the iniquity of all placed onto one. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. This is one of the most precise and most unexplained details in the passage. The silence is voluntary. It is not the silence of someone rendered incapable of speech by trauma or fear. It is the silence of someone who could speak and chooses not to. The lamb does not fight the hand that leads it to slaughter, because lambs do not understand what is happening. The servant is silent for a different reason, and the text does not explain what that reason is. It simply records that he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people, cut off out of the land of the living. This is death, not metaphorical death, not the death of influence or reputation. The servant dies. He is removed from the category of the living. And then a detail that is specific enough to produce a kind of vertigo when you read it carefully. And they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. His grave with the wicked, with a rich man in his death. Two things are said about the burial. It was arranged to be with the wicked, which means the intention was a shameful burial, the kind reserved for criminals and those who died in disgrace. But it was also with a rich man. The two things seem to contradict each other, and the text does not resolve the contradiction. It simply states both. It is a detail specific enough to be almost impossible to invent if you do not know how the story ends. It is too particular, too strange, too precise in its combination of elements to be a general description of a typical death. It reads like the report of someone who was present, or who received the account from someone who was, yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. After the death, after the crushing, after the grave with the wicked and the rich man, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The servant who died sees offspring. The servant whose days were cut off has his days prolonged. The text, without using the word resurrection, describes a life that continues after the death it has just recorded. Not symbolically, not as a metaphor for legacy or influence. The servant who was cut off out of the land of the living sees offspring and prolongs his days. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. The satisfaction after the anguish, the making of many righteous, the bearing of iniquities. The passage ends where it began, with the exaltation it announced before it described the suffering. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. Numbered with the transgressors, he poured out his soul to death. He bore the sin of many. Now, we need to address the question that this passage has forced on every serious reader for more than 2,000 years. Who is the servant? There are three primary answers that serious people with serious commitments to the text have given, and intellectual honesty requires that we engage all three before we say anything further. The first answer is Israel as a collective. This is the dominant reading within the Jewish interpretive tradition from approximately the 2nd century of the Common Era onward. The servant who is described suffering in Isaiah 53 is the Jewish people itself. Suffering in exile. Suffering under the nations. Bearing in its historical experience the kind of rejection and physical affliction the passage describes. This reading has genuine textual support. Israel is explicitly called God's servant elsewhere in Isaiah. The servant songs in chapters 42, 49, and 50 appear to alternate between an individual and a collective, referent in ways that resist clean separation. But it has problems the honest reader cannot dismiss. One is grammatical. The passage uses pronouns in ways that are difficult to sustain on the collective reading. The we who are healed by his wounds, the us whose iniquities he bears, are distinguished from the he who bears them. The speaker and the subject are different figures. If the servant is Israel, who is the we? What population is being distinguished from Israel as the ones on whose behalf Israel suffers? Another problem is the innocence of the servant. He had done no violence. There was no deceit in his mouth. He was oppressed and afflicted, and made his grave with the wicked. And the reason given is not his own guilt, but the guilt of the we and the us on whose behalf he suffers. Israel's historical suffering, while real and profound and deserving of acknowledgement, has not been the suffering of the entirely innocent. The Hebrew Bible is relentlessly honest about this. The collective reading requires a level of innocence for the servant that the Hebrew Bible itself does not attribute to Israel. The second answer is Isaiah himself. A small number of scholars have proposed that the servant songs, including chapter 53, are autobiographical, that Isaiah is describing his own experience of speaking truth to power, being rejected, suffering the consequences of faithful witness. This has a certain poetic logic. Isaiah did suffer for his faithfulness. He may well have died violently under Manasseh. But the passage describes things that do not fit Isaiah's biography. The making of many righteous by his knowledge, the prolonging of days after death, the seeing of offspring after being cut off. These are not descriptions of a man whose teaching survives him, which is the best that could be claimed for Isaiah on this reading. They describe something that happens to the servant himself after his death. The third answer is the one that the earliest Jewish interpretive tradition, before the 2nd century of the Common Era, considered seriously. The Aramaic translation of the Hebrew Scriptures called the Targum of Jonathan, produced by Jewish scholars for Jewish audiences, before Christianity had developed significant theological literature, opens Isaiah 52 verse 13 with these words, "Behold, my servant the Messiah shall prosper." That translation, made by Jewish scholars for Jewish readers before the Christian era had begun to press the question in the way it would later press it, opens the passage with a messianic identification. The servant of Isaiah 53 is the Messiah. The early rabbinic literature preserved in the Talmud, in the tractate Sanhedrin, includes a discussion of the name of the Messiah. One tradition in that passage gives the name of the Messiah as the leprous one of the house of Rabbi, drawing directly on imagery from Isaiah 53. These traditions predate the period when Jewish-Christian debate made the messianic reading of Isaiah 53 contested territory. They represent Jewish scholars reading their own text without the pressure of that later debate, and finding in it a figure who suffers on behalf of others in a way that leads them naturally to messianic categories. Now we come to the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1947, among the materials found in the caves above Qumran was a complete scroll of Isaiah. We have been with this scroll since the opening of our story, but now we need to return to it with a specific focus. The Isaiah scroll from Qumran has been dated by paleographic and radiocarbon analysis to somewhere between 150 and 100 years before the birth of Christ. It is the oldest complete manuscript of any biblical book ever discovered, and it contains Isaiah 53. Complete, in a form that is, with minor variations that do not affect the meaning of any significant passage, essentially identical to the text that has been transmitted through the Jewish and Christian traditions for 2,000 years. What this means is that the text we have been reading in this chapter is not a text that could have been written after the fact to match events. The servant who was pierced for our transgressions, the servant who made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man, the servant who was numbered with the transgressors and bore the sin of many, was written in a scroll that was copied by scribes in the desert at least a century before the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. The question of who the servant is must be answered without the protection of the claim that the text was shaped by later editors who knew how the story ended. It was already there, complete, waiting, and then, in the 8th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles, there is a scene. An official from Ethiopia, a man of significant position who serves the Queen of Ethiopia, is traveling home from Jerusalem in his chariot. He has been to Jerusalem to worship, which tells us this is a man who has been in serious contact with the Jewish tradition, who takes it seriously enough to make the journey. He is reading as he travels. He is reading Isaiah chapter 53. A man named Philip, prompted by what the text calls the Spirit, runs up to the chariot and asks, "Do you understand what you are reading?" And the official says something that is among the most honest admissions in the entire New Testament. "How can I, unless someone guides me?" He is not pretending to understand. He is reading the text with the full force of his intelligence and his genuine spiritual seriousness. And he is admitting that the text is resisting him in the way that things resist you when they are larger than your current framework for understanding them. And then he asks the question, "About whom? I ask you, does the prophet say this? About himself or about someone else?" It is the same question that the rabbinic tradition was wrestling with, the same question that serious scholars in every century since have returned to. It is the honest question, not asked from a position of confident interpretation seeking confirmation, asked from a position of genuine uncertainty by someone who has read the text carefully enough to know that it requires more than a casual reading to yield what it contains. Philip began with that scripture, and he told him the good news about Jesus. The passage ends there, without recording the content of what Philip said, without giving us the argument, the exegesis, The particular way that Philip connected Isaiah 53 to the person of Jesus, in a way sufficient to move a serious, educated, religiously committed man to ask for baptism at the first body of water they passed. We only know that it started with the text. With these words, "The servant who was pierced, the lamb who did not open his mouth, the grave with the wicked and the rich man, the days prolonged after the cutting off." Philip started there, and the Ethiopian official, riding in his chariot through the desert, reading words written 500 years before either of them was born, found in them something sufficient to change the direction of his life. We are not going to close the question for you, because it should not be closed by someone else. The text is there. It has been there for more than 2,700 years. It was there before the events it appears to describe. It was copied by scribes who believed it was worth preserving. It was hidden in a jar in a cave by people who believed it was worth protecting through whatever was coming. And the question the Ethiopian official asked in his chariot is still the right question. About whom does the prophet say this? The honest answer, in the tradition of the Ethiopian official who was willing to admit that he did not understand without a guide, is that the question deserves to be held open long enough to feel the full weight of what hangs on the answer. Philip had an answer. He started with this scripture and told the good news about Jesus. Chapter 10. The man who wrote names into the dark. Think about what it actually means to write a name. Not your own name. Not the name of someone sitting across the table from you. Someone whose face you can see, and whose voice you can hear, and whose existence you can verify with every sense available to you. The name of someone who has not been born yet. Someone who will not be born for another 150 years. Someone whose parents have not been born, whose grandparents have not been born. Someone who belongs to a future so distant from your present that the civilizations which will produce them have not yet taken the shapes they will eventually take. You write the name down. You give this person a role in history. You describe what they will do and what they will accomplish and what they will be called by the people who benefit from what they do. You close the scroll. You go home, and you live the rest of your life knowing that the only way anyone will ever know whether you were right is if you are long dead when it happens. That is what Isaiah did with the name Cyrus. And before we look at what he wrote and what eventually happened, it is worth staying with the human weight of that for a moment, because the theological argument about whether predictive prophecy is possible is a real argument worth having. But underneath it is a simpler and in some ways more demanding question. What does it cost a person to do that? What does it cost to write something you cannot verify? To put your name on it? To speak it into the air of a world that has no mechanism for confirming it? And then to keep living in that world for the decades that follow as the person who said it? Isaiah was not writing from a library. He was writing from inside a life. He had walked through the streets of Jerusalem and watched the people he loved choose the wrong things. He had delivered a death sentence to a king and then been sent back to deliver the reversal. He had spoken into the reign of 4 kings and been mostly ignored by 3 of them. He had done all of that and was still doing it. And in the middle of all of that, he wrote a name into the dark. Let us begin with the world as it existed when he wrote it. We are in the latter half of the 8th century before Christ. The dominant power in the ancient Near East is Assyria. Isaiah has watched Tiglath-Pileser III reorganize an empire. He has watched Samaria fall to Sargon II. He has watched Sennacherib besiege Jerusalem and withdraw without firing a single arrow at the walls. Babylon, in this period, is significant but not supreme. It is a city of considerable cultural and religious importance, a center of learning and astronomical observation and literary tradition that stretches back centuries. But it is not the dominant military power of the world. It exists within the orbit of Assyrian influence, periodically asserting independence, periodically being brought back into line. Babylon will become the dominant power of the world under Nebuchadnezzar. But Nebuchadnezzar will not begin his reign until approximately 605 years before Christ, more than a century after Isaiah's death. When Isaiah writes about Babylon, he is writing about the eventual fate of something that has not yet reached the peak of its power. And he is writing about a king of Persia, who says of Cyrus, "He is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill all my purpose," saying of Jerusalem, "She shall be built," and of the temple, "Your foundation shall be laid." Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him and to loose the belts of kings, to open doors before him that gates may not be closed. Cyrus, not a description of a type of king, not a reference to a future leader who will do certain things. A name, the name of the specific king of Persia who will issue the decree authorizing the Jewish exiles to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple. Cyrus the Great founded the Achaemenid Persian Empire. He conquered Babylon in the year 539 before Christ, and he issued what historians call the Cyrus Cylinder, a clay document recording his policy of allowing displaced peoples to return to their homelands and restore their temples. The Hebrew Bible, in the book of Ezra, records the specific decree he issued regarding the Jewish people. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord." Cyrus, the pagan king of Persia, releasing the Jewish exiles and authorizing the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, crediting the God of Israel as the source of his imperial authority. This is the man Isaiah named. The gap between Isaiah and Cyrus, depending on the precise dates assigned to Isaiah's ministry, is somewhere between 150 and 200 years. It is not a small gap that might be explained by the natural foresight of a perceptive political observer. It is a gap that places the two figures in entirely different worlds, with entirely different political configurations, entirely different dominant powers, and no visible line of continuity connecting them that a human analyst could have traced in advance. Now let us be honest about the range of responses to this. The most common scholarly response to the naming of Cyrus is the one that generated the entire debate about the authorship of the second half of Isaiah. If a text names Cyrus, and the naming of Cyrus in advance of his existence is impossible, then the text must have been written after Cyrus. Therefore, the second half of Isaiah was written during or after the Babylonian exile. Not by Isaiah of Jerusalem, but by a later prophet writing in his tradition. This is a logically coherent position, held by serious scholars who have spent their careers engaging with these texts. But it contains an assumption that should be named as an assumption rather than presented as a demonstrated fact. The assumption is that predictive prophecy of this specificity is impossible, that the naming of a future individual by name, before that individual exists, is not a category of thing that can happen. If you hold that assumption, then the text must have been written after the fact. The logic is clean, but the assumption itself is not a conclusion of the evidence. It is a prior commitment about what kinds of things are possible that is brought to the evidence before the evidence is examined. It is a philosophical position, not a historical finding. The honest engagement with the text requires acknowledging both the force of the scholarly argument and the circularity at its foundation. Now let us turn to Babylon itself. Isaiah chapters 13 and 14 contain an extended oracle against Babylon that is remarkable not only for its content, but for its specificity about the nature of Babylon's eventual fate. Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pride of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. It will never be inhabited or lived in for all generations. No Arab will pitch his tent there. No shepherds will make their flocks lie down there. When Isaiah wrote these words, Babylon was on the trajectory toward becoming the greatest city the ancient world had ever produced. Under Nebuchadnezzar, it would become a wonder. The walls, the gates, the processional way, the astronomical records that would be consulted by scholars for centuries. Babylon, at its height, was the kind of city that seemed to justify the human ambition that built it. And Isaiah said it would become a place where no one lived, where no Arab would pitch a tent, where no shepherd would bring a flock. Babylon was conquered by Cyrus the Persian in 539 before Christ, without the kind of violent destruction that ended most ancient cities. It continued to be inhabited for centuries after the Persian conquest. Under Alexander the Great, it was briefly the capital of his empire. It remained populated into the early centuries of the Common Era. But then it became what Isaiah said it would become. Today, the site of ancient Babylon is located near a city called Hilla in modern Iraq. The ancient ruins are present. The archaeological evidence of what was there is extensive and well documented. But the city itself is not there. It was not rebuilt in the location where it stood. The specific coordinates that were once the most powerful address in the ancient world are exactly as Isaiah described: uninhabited. No Arab pitches a tent there. No shepherd makes flocks lie down there. Now let us come back to the man, because here is what the history of Cyrus and Babylon does not tell us. It does not tell us what Isaiah felt when he wrote those names. And that is the question that has been waiting underneath everything in this chapter from the first sentence. Not whether the prophecies were accurate, not whether the scholarly debate about authorship has been resolved, not whether predictive prophecy is possible in principle. What did it feel like to write a name you had no way of verifying? To describe the fate of a city at the height of its power? To close the scroll and carry those words for the rest of your life in a world that had no mechanism for confirming them? There is a particular loneliness in that. Not the loneliness of isolation. Isaiah was not isolated. He had a household, a community, a relationship with kings and priests and ordinary people on the streets of the city he loved. He was, by any external measure, a man embedded in the life of his time and place. But the loneliness of carrying words that the people around you cannot yet evaluate. The loneliness of having said things that the full meaning of will only become clear after you are gone. The loneliness of knowing that the confirmation you need to show the people who are skeptical will arrive in a world you will not inhabit. Most of us can absorb that kind of loneliness for a short time. Some people can sustain it for years. Isaiah sustained it for 60 years. Not because he had a different emotional architecture than other human beings. Not because the difficulty of it was somehow lighter for him than it would be for anyone else. But because he had something that made the loneliness bearable in a way that nothing else could have made it bearable. He had been in the temple in the year Uzziah died. He had seen the seraphim covering their faces before the one whose robe filled the building. He had heard the holy, holy, holy that required 3 repetitions because the language broke before it could contain the reality. He had had a burning coal pressed against his lips by a hand that came from the altar. And then he had said, "Here I am. Send me." The names he wrote into the dark were written by a man who had stood at the edge of something so vast that the darkness of the present was, by comparison, a small thing, not easy, not comfortable, not without cost, but small in the way that all things become small when they are measured against what he had seen. He did not write Cyrus because he had done the geopolitical analysis and arrived at a conclusion. He wrote Cyrus because he was writing from inside something larger than his own vantage point. Because the morning in the temple had opened something that the subsequent 60 years had not closed. And the names he wrote, the names that seemed to belong to darkness, because no light in his present moment could illuminate them, were eventually found in the historical record, attached to actual people doing actual things in a world that Isaiah was long gone from. Cyrus, authorizing the return of the exiles. Babylon, becoming empty ground. The names were written into the dark, and the dark, in time, became light enough to read them by. That is not a proof. It does not resolve the philosophical debate about the nature of prophetic knowledge. It does not silence the scholarly argument about the authorship of the second half of Isaiah. But it is something. It is the thing a man carries when he closes the scroll and goes home for the night, having written the name of someone who will not be born for 150 years. In a world that has no way to confirm what he has written, he had been in the temple. He had seen what he had seen, and the seeing was enough to keep writing. Into the dark, with the names of people who had not yet arrived to claim them. Chapter 11. The Year of Favor. There is a moment in Luke chapter 4 that is almost too precise to be accidental. Jesus has returned to Nazareth, the town where he grew up, the place where people know his mother's name and his father's trade, and the particular quality of his childhood that makes it difficult for them to place him in any category larger than the one they already have for him. He is, to them, the carpenter's son, the boy they watched grow up, the person whose ordinariness they are intimately acquainted with in the way that only people who have known you since before you were significant can be acquainted with your ordinariness. He goes into the synagogue on the Sabbath. This is his custom. The text says, not a special occasion, not a moment he has prepared for. The regular practice of a regular day, in the rhythm of a life organized around the rhythms of Jewish observance. He stands up to read. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah is handed to him. Now let us stay with that moment before we read what he reads, because the moment itself contains something easy to move past in the interest of getting to the famous part. In a first-century synagogue, the reading of the prophets was not entirely random. There were established portions, established readings, a cycle of texts that moved through the year in a pattern the community knew. But there was also, apparently, some flexibility. The reader could find a passage, or the passage was assigned for that particular Sabbath. Either way, when the scroll of Isaiah was placed in his hands and he opened it, what he found was this: "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 and 2. And then he stopped. He rolled up the scroll. He gave it back to the attendant. He sat down, which in the synagogue tradition was the posture of the teacher about to speak. And every eye in the synagogue was fixed on him. Every eye. And he said, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. Let us spend time with each element of this moment, because each one is doing significant work." First, the text itself. Isaiah 61 opens with a description of an anointed figure. The Spirit of the Lord is upon this figure. The anointing is the mechanism of the Spirit's presence, the formal consecration of someone for a specific task. In the Hebrew tradition, anointing was the act performed at the commissioning of priests, kings, and in some cases prophets. It was not a general spiritual blessing. It was the formal installation of someone into a role with specific responsibilities. And the responsibilities listed in Isaiah 61 are specific. Good news to the poor, not comfort to the comfortable, not encouragement to those whose circumstances are already favorable. Good news specifically to the people who have no good news in their immediate situation. The poor in the Hebrew tradition are not simply the economically disadvantaged, though they are certainly that. They are the people whose vulnerability is comprehensive, who have no resources to buffer them from the impact of what happens to them, who are entirely dependent on the faithfulness of others and the mercy of God. Liberty to the captives. The word for captive here is the word for people who are bound, constrained, held in a condition not of their choosing, from which they cannot free themselves by their own effort. The liberty being proclaimed is not a gradual improvement in conditions. It is release. The door being opened, recovery of sight to the blind. Not better vision for those who see poorly, sight for those who have none. The the restoration of a capacity that was absent, not the improvement of a capacity that was diminished. Liberty for the oppressed, the crushed ones, the people whose situation is not merely difficult but pressing, in the physical sense of weight bearing down without relief. And then the phrase that anchors all of the others: to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. This phrase is a direct reference to the Jubilee year in the legislation of Leviticus. Every 50th year in ancient Israel was to be a Jubilee, a year in which debts were canceled, slaves were freed, and land that had been sold was returned to its original family. The economic reset that the Jubilee was designed to accomplish was intended to prevent the permanent stratification of Israelite society into a class of permanently wealthy landowners and a class of permanently indebted laborers. The Jubilee was the mechanism by which the community was to remind itself, every 50 years, that the accumulation of human social arrangements did not have the final word on the distribution of freedom and resource and dignity. The historical evidence suggests that the Jubilee was rarely, if ever, actually observed in ancient Israel. The economic interests of those who had accumulated land and wealth were too powerful, the mechanisms of enforcement too weak, and the disruption to established arrangements too significant for the ideal to translate consistently into practice. It remained on the books as a provision of the law that described what the covenant community was supposed to be, without describing what it actually was. Isaiah 61 is announcing that a Jubilee is coming, not the kind that Leviticus legislated and that was never consistently implemented. A Jubilee of a different order, a proclamation of freedom and release and restoration that is not dependent on the willingness of those who have accumulated to give back what they have accumulated. A liberty that comes from outside the system of human social arrangements rather than from a provision within them. The year of the Lord's favor. Now let us come back to Jesus in the synagogue. He read that passage, and he stopped before he finished the sentence. The full text of Isaiah 61 verse 2 reads, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, and the day of vengeance of our God. Jesus read the first half of that sentence and stopped. He did not read the second half. He rolled up the scroll before he arrived at the day of vengeance of our God. This is not an accident. It is not an oversight. It is not a loss of his place in the text. It is a deliberate choice, made in front of the community, about what he was there to announce on that particular day in that particular synagogue. The year of the Lord's favor was what he was proclaiming. The day of vengeance was not what he was there to announce. Not because that day is absent from the prophetic picture. It is present in Isaiah. It is present in the full text of Isaiah 61 that he chose not to finish reading. But the moment he was standing in, the role he was occupying on that Sabbath in Nazareth, was the favor, the release, the good news to the poor, and the liberty to the captives, and the recovery of sight to the blind. He stopped in the middle of a sentence, because the sentence had two parts, and only one of them was what this moment was for. Then he sat down and said, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." 3 words that carry the entire weight of the moment. In the Greek that Luke writes, semeron pepleroth hegraph, today it has been fulfilled. The verb is perfect passive, something that has been completed, the effects of which are present and ongoing. Not today this scripture begins to be fulfilled. Not today we can see the beginning of the fulfillment process. Today it has been fulfilled, accomplished, done, in your hearing, not somewhere else. Not in a future you will not live to see. In the specific acoustic space of this room, at this moment, with you as the witnesses. The hearing is not incidental. The hearing is where the fulfillment is happening. The scripture being spoken into this room, by this voice, to these people, on this day, is the fulfillment. The congregation's initial response is striking. They were amazed. The text says they marveled at the gracious words coming from his mouth. They said, "Is this not Joseph's son?" The amazement and the identification of his background come together in a way that suggests both genuine wonder and the immediate instinct to manage the wonder by reducing him to a category already available to them. He is amazing, and he is Joseph's son. The two things held together in the initial response, before the tension between them becomes too great to hold. Then he pushes further. He tells them that no prophet is accepted in his hometown. He gives them two examples from their own scripture: the feeding of Elijah by the widow of Zarephath in Sidon, the healing of Naaman the Syrian by Elisha, both of which involved a prophet of Israel bringing the extraordinary work of God to someone outside Israel, while people within Israel were being passed over. This is where the congregation's response shifts. When they heard these things, all in the synagogue were filled with wrath. The transition from marveling to wrath is not illogical. It follows from the implication of what he said. If the year of the Lord's favor has arrived, if the Jubilee is here, if the proclamation of liberty is being made, and if the people in the synagogue in Nazareth are being compared to the people of Israel who watched Elijah go to a Sidonian widow and Elisha go to a Syrian general while they went without, then the implication is that the favor being proclaimed is not exclusively for them, that it may, in fact, be going to the people they expected it to bypass. They drove him out of the town and led him to the edge of the hill on which it was built, intending to throw him off. He passed through their midst and went away. Luke records the scene without dramatic commentary. The congregation that marveled is now a mob. The hometown that produced him is now expelling him, and he walks through the middle of it and continues. Now let us step back and hold Isaiah 61 inside the larger architecture of the book we have been following. We began with Isaiah in the temple in the year Uzziah died. The vision, the commission, the here I am. We followed him through the reigns of 4 kings, through the Emmanuel sign and the child with 4 names, and the light in Galilee, and the hinge of Hezekiah. We moved into the second half of the book with the comfort of chapter 40. The servant songs building through 4 movements. The passage we have just spent a full chapter with. And Isaiah 61 is the culmination of a thread that runs through all of it. The thread of anointing in Isaiah chapter 42. The first servant song. The servant is introduced with these words: I have put my spirit upon him. The same spirit that rests on the figure of Isaiah 61. The same anointing. The same endowment of divine capacity for a specific role. In Isaiah chapter 49, the second servant song, the servant speaks of being called from the womb, of being formed for a purpose before birth, of being given as a light to the nations. The scope of the servant's work extends beyond Israel to encompass a universal horizon. In Isaiah chapter 50, the third servant song, the servant describes what the task costs: the back given to those who strike, the cheeks given to those who pull out the beard, the obedience that continues through the suffering without retreat. In Isaiah chapters 52 and 53, the fourth servant song, the suffering reaches its climax and its resolution. The servant pierced for the transgressions of others, the grave with the wicked and the rich, the days prolonged after being cut off. And then Isaiah 61, the anointed one, after all of the servant songs, stands up and speaks in the first person. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me. The servant who was described in the third person through the earlier songs now speaks, and what he says is a proclamation, not a lament, not a description of suffering, an announcement of what the suffering has made possible. The good news, the liberty, the recovery, the favor. Jesus, standing in the synagogue in Nazareth, reading this passage and saying, "Today this has been fulfilled in your hearing," was not simply applying a general messianic text to himself in a creative way. He was identifying himself as the voice at the end of the servant song sequence, the one who had been anointed, who had been sent, who was now standing in a specific room on a specific Sabbath to make the proclamation that the servant songs had been building toward. Today, not in the future, not when the conditions are finally right, not after the proper theological preparation has been completed and the appropriate authorities have given their approval. Today, in the middle of an ordinary Sabbath in an unremarkable synagogue in a hometown that was already in the process of deciding it did not like what it was hearing, the year of the Lord's favor does not wait for favorable conditions. It is proclaimed into the unfavorable ones. The good news goes to the poor, not to the comfortable. The liberty is for the captive, not for those already free. The recovery of sight is for the blind, not for those who can already see clearly. And on the day it is proclaimed, in the synagogue where the proclamation is made, the initial response is wonder that tips into fury because the implications are too uncomfortable to receive without resistance. Isaiah wrote those words in the 8th century before Christ. He did not know who the Anointed One would be. He knew the role. He knew the task. He knew the qualities of the Spirit that would rest on the one who occupied the position. He described the proclamation before the one who would make it had been born. And then a man from Nazareth, in a synagogue in Nazareth, on an ordinary Sabbath, unrolled the scroll that those words were written on, and read them in the first person, and stopped in the middle of a sentence, and said, "Today." Chapter 12. The Highway and the Homecoming. Isaiah keeps returning to an image that should not make literal sense. A highway through the desert, built before the travelers who will need it have even left home, prepared in the wilderness for a journey that has not yet begun, through terrain that has historically been understood as the place where journeys end, rather than the place where they are safely completed. The desert in the ancient Near East was not a romantic landscape. It was the place of death by thirst, death by exposure, death by the particular loneliness of being small in a vast and unresponsive emptiness that did not care whether you made it through. And Isaiah keeps describing a road being built through it. Not built after the crisis has passed and the conditions are favorable. Built in advance. The preparation precedes the need. The road exists before the travelers arrive to use it. That temporal reversal is not incidental. It is the theological point. Let us begin with the first appearance of the image in Isaiah chapter 35. The chapter opens in a landscape of transformation. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom like a crocus. The imagery is botanical, which is appropriate, because what is being described is the reversal of conditions that seem fixed. The desert does not naturally blossom. The wilderness is not naturally glad. These states, arid and lifeless and resistant to flourishing, are being described in the process of becoming something they have never been. And a highway shall be there, and it shall be called the way of holiness. The unclean shall not pass over it. It shall belong to those who walk on the way. Even if they are fools, they shall not go astray. The way of holiness, a road through the wilderness that is itself a holy thing, not merely a useful thing. And notice who it is engineered for. Even if they are fools, they shall not go astray. Not for the skilled and the resourceful who would find their way regardless. For the ones who would otherwise be lost. The road is built for the people least equipped to navigate without it. No lion shall be there, nor shall any ravenous beast come up on it. They shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there. The dangers that make wilderness travel lethal are absent from this road, not minimized, not managed with appropriate precautions. Absent. And the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be upon their heads. They shall obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. Return, coming to Zion. The destination of the road through the wilderness is home. Now let us move to chapter 40, where we have already spent time with the comfort that opens the second half of the book. In the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. The preparation is infrastructural. Valleys lifted, mountains lowered, uneven ground leveled, rough places made smooth. This is the work of a road crew preparing for a royal procession, described in the language of actual earth moving, actual terrain modification, the specific physical work of making passage possible through ground that resists passage. But the terrain being modified is not only literal. The mountains too high, the valleys too low, the rough and uneven ground that makes the journey impossible, are also the conditions of human hearts and human situations that stand between people and the arrival of what God is bringing to them. The preparation of the way is the work of creating in human life and human community the conditions that allow what is coming to reach the people it is intended to reach. John the Baptist understood himself as doing this work. His ministry of baptism in the Jordan River, his call to repentance, his insistence that the arrival of something significant required a preparation the people of his generation had not yet undergone, was the practical application of the Isaiah 40 image to a specific historical moment. But notice what John understood about his role. He was not the arrival. He was the preparation for the arrival. After me comes he who is mightier than I, the strap of whose sandals I am not worthy to stoop down and untie. John's clarity about the precise boundary between his role and the role of the one coming after him was itself an act of the preparation he was describing. He was doing exactly what the voice in Isaiah 40 was doing: preparing, announcing, pointing. Now let us follow the highway image into Isaiah chapter 43. Thus says the Lord, who makes a way in the sea, a path in the mighty waters, who brings forth chariot and horse, army and warrior. They lie down. They cannot rise. They are extinguished, quenched like a wick. This is a reference to the Exodus, the parting of the Red Sea, the path through the mighty waters, the drowning of Pharaoh's army, the crossing of dry ground in the middle of water that should have killed everyone walking through it. The Exodus was the defining event of Israel's national memory, the moment that made them a people, the event by which they understood who God was and what God did on behalf of the people he had chosen. And then Isaiah says something extraordinary. Remember not the former things, nor consider the things of old. Do not remember the Exodus. This is almost incomprehensible to a first-century Jewish reader. The entire structure of Jewish religious life was organized around remembering the Exodus, the Passover, the central festival of the Jewish year, was a structured act of communal memory. The foundational claim of the covenant was, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And Isaiah is saying, do not remember the former things, not because they were not real, not because they were not significant, but because what is coming is so much larger than what came before, that the point of reference needs to change. Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. A new exodus. A new path through impossible terrain. Not through a sea this time. Through a wilderness. Not with water held back by divine intervention. With water flowing through dry ground, turning the landscape of death into a landscape of life. The first exodus was from Egypt, a journey from slavery to a land of promise through a wilderness of approximately 40 years. A journey that required a generation to complete. The new thing Isaiah is describing is different in its quality. The rivers in the desert do not require 40 years of wandering. The way in the wilderness is already prepared. The road is there. The water is there. And then, immediately after this description of the new Exodus, something that brings the whole image into focus. I am he who blots out your transgressions for my own sake, and I will not remember your sins. The new Exodus is not primarily a geographical journey. It is a journey from a condition of accumulated guilt to a condition of forgiven relationship. The highway through the wilderness is the road from what has been to what can be. The rivers in the desert are the presence of life and sustenance in a landscape that had no natural source of either. The new thing that springs forth is a restoration of relationship that the former thing could not accomplish. The first Exodus brought the people out of Egypt. The new thing brings them out of what Egypt was only a symbol of, the deeper bondage that geography alone could not address. Now let us bring this image to the place where it connects most directly to the story we have been following. John the Baptist was not merely a historical figure who happened to quote Isaiah 40 as a way of situating his ministry in the prophetic tradition. He was, in his own self-understanding and in the understanding of the gospel writers who recorded his ministry, the embodiment of the image. He was the voice in the wilderness. He was the road crew. He was the advance preparation for a new exodus that was about to make the former thing something that pointed beyond itself. And the one he was preparing the way for was, in the understanding of the New Testament, the one through whom the new thing Isaiah had announced would arrive, not as a geographical journey, as a journey from the accumulated weight of what human beings had done with their freedom back to the relationship that the accumulated weight had obscured. The good news to the poor, the liberty to the captives, the recovery of sight to the blind, the year of the Lord's favor, the new creation in which the wilderness becomes a garden and the desert produces rivers. All of these images in Isaiah are describing the same event from different angles. A return from exile that is also a new creation. A journey home that is also the arrival of something that has never been fully present before. A road through what should be impassable that leads not just to a destination but to a condition that no previous destination in human experience had managed to produce. But let us hold one more thing before we leave this chapter. The highway image in Isaiah is specifically for people who cannot navigate the terrain without it. Even if they are fools, they shall not go astray. The road through the wilderness is not for the spiritually accomplished, not for the people who have mastered the terrain through years of practice, not for the ones who have the resources and the knowledge and the capacity to find their way regardless. It is for the fools, for the ones without capacity, for the ones who, left to navigate on their own, would be lost in the desert before they reached any destination at all. The highway is grace in geographical form. It is the presence of a prepared path for people who did not prepare it and who could not have navigated without it, going to a destination they did not earn and could not have reached by their own effort. That is what Isaiah saw in the wilderness. Again and again, a road being built before the travelers arrive, a path through impossible terrain, a way home for people who had no way home, and the one who stood in the Jordan River announcing that the road was ready, pointing to someone coming who was mightier than him, whose sandals he was not worthy to untie, was standing in the wilderness that Isaiah had described, crying out, "Prepare the way, the road is there, come home." Chapter 13. The Ordinary Man. We have been following Isaiah through 8 centuries of prophecy, through the collapse of nations and the birth of empires, through the vision that unmade him and the commission that remade him, through the reigns of 4 kings, 2 of whom refused to hear him, and 1 of whom was the worst his nation ever produced, through the names written into the dark and the servant songs that built toward the passage that has been debated for 2,000 years. Through the highway in the wilderness and the comfort spoken over people who had not yet experienced the suffering it was comforting them for. We have been at altitude for a long time. Now let us come down, back to the ground, back to the specific, ordinary, unrepeatable texture of a human life, being lived in a specific place, in a specific time, by a specific person who woke up every morning in the same world everyone else woke up in and went to bed every night, having spent another day doing the most difficult thing a human being can do for 60 years. Let us stay for a moment with an old man. Not Isaiah the prophet, not Isaiah the theological category, Not Isaiah, the source of more than 400 New Testament quotations, or the author of the passage that has made rabbis uncomfortable for 2,000 years. Just Isaiah, the man, getting old in a city that he loved and that largely did not love him back, under a king who was systematically destroying everything that the best king Isaiah had ever served, had spent his life building. The years under Hezekiah had been the best years. Not the easiest years. The Assyrian crisis. The 185,000 soldiers in the camp outside the walls. The death sentence delivered and then reversed. The sundial moving backward. None of that was easy. But those were years in which Isaiah's work had a receiver. A man on a throne who asked real questions and waited for real answers and then, in the most demanding moments, actually acted on what he heard. That kind of reception changes a person. Not because it makes the work easier, but because it connects the work to its purpose in a way that the years of speaking into non-reception cannot. Hezekiah showed Isaiah what it looked like when the words landed. When the prayer was the actual prayer of a man actually in need of something actually beyond his capacity. When the turning of a face to the wall was not performance but the last honest gesture of someone at the end of what he could manage on his own. Isaiah had been present to that, had walked out of the room with one word and come back with another, and had watched the 15 years be added to a life that the first word had ended. Those years were the best, and then Hezekiah died. He had been sick. He had prayed. He had been given 15 years. And in those 15 years, the text tells us he had a son. The son was 12 years old when Hezekiah died, and he became king. His name was Manasseh. Now let us understand what it meant for Isaiah to watch that happen. Isaiah had known Hezekiah for decades. He had walked beside him through the worst crisis the nation had faced in a generation. He had been the voice that told the king the 185,000 would not fire a single arrow at the walls. And had been right. He had delivered a death sentence to Hezekiah and had come back with a reversal. He had watched this man trust God in the specific, costly, unperformative way that Isaiah had been describing and calling for and working toward for the entirety of his ministry. And the fruit of that trust, the child born in the 15 added years, grew up and became Manasseh. The text of 2 Chronicles does not spare the details. Manasseh rebuilt the high places that Hezekiah had destroyed. He erected altars to Baal. He made Asherah poles. He worshipped the host of heaven. He built altars to foreign gods in the courts of the temple. In the very building that Hezekiah had cleaned and rededicated, and in which Isaiah had walked beside a king who was willing to spread a threatening letter before God and simply say, "Look at this. I have nothing else." He practiced divination and sorcery. He consulted mediums and necromancers. The text says he sacrificed his sons to fire. And then the sentence that tells us what the reign of Manasseh meant for the people who had stood with Hezekiah. Moreover, Manasseh shed very much innocent blood, till he had filled Jerusalem from one end to the other, filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, from one end to the other. The people being killed were the people who represented what Hezekiah had represented, the priests who had served in the reformed temple, the prophets who had spoken with Hezekiah's ear, the community of people who had organized their lives around the conviction that the God of Israel was real and present and worthy of the kind of trust that Hezekiah had shown. They were being killed, and Isaiah was old. We do not know exactly how old. The chronology of his ministry is not precise enough to assign him a specific age in the early years of Manasseh's reign, but he had been in ministry since approximately the year 740 before Christ. And Manasseh took the throne around 697. That is a minimum of 40 years. By any standard of the ancient world, he was an old man. An old man watching the city he had spent 60 years calling back to something better, being led by the son of the man who had come closest to hearing him, into the deepest darkness it had ever produced. What do you do with that? What does a person do with the specific grief of watching the reversal of everything they gave their life to? not the abstract grief of a cause going badly. The particular, personal grief of watching your life's work being undone by the son of the person whose reign seemed to vindicate it. The text does not tell us. The book of Isaiah does not give us Isaiah's interior life in the years of Manasseh. We have no diary, no letters, no account of what he said to his wife on the evenings when the reports from the city were what they were. What we have is the book. And the book, in its final chapters, does something that is the most surprising thing about it, given everything we know about the circumstances in which those final chapters were likely produced. It does not despair. Isaiah chapters 65 and 66, the final chapters of the book, contain some of the most expansive and most hope-saturated material in the entire Hebrew Bible. New heavens and a new earth. Every mountain and hill brought low, and every valley lifted up. The wolf and the lamb feeding together. The gathering of all nations. The proclamation of a restoration so complete that the former things will not even be remembered, will not even come to mind. This is what the old man was writing. While Manasseh was filling Jerusalem with innocent blood, while the altars that Hezekiah had torn down were being rebuilt, while the temple that had been cleaned and rededicated was being occupied by the gods that the Torah had the most unambiguous possible language against, an old man, watching all of that, was writing about a new creation. You do not write about a new creation if you have given up. You write about a new creation when you have been in the temple in the year Uzziah died, when you have seen the seraphim cover their faces before the Holy, 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 when you have had a burning coal pressed against your lips by a hand from the altar, and when you have spent 60 years discovering that the thing you saw in that moment was real, in a way that 60 years of the world's contradicting evidence has not been able to unmake. You write about a new creation when you have something to write from that is not the current conditions. Isaiah had something to write from. Now let us speak honestly about the tradition of his death. The tradition is old. It appears in multiple sources. The Talmud mentions it. Justin Martyr, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, knew it. Tertullian knew it. The document called the Ascension of Isaiah, a Jewish text that predates significant Christian influence on the tradition, describes it in detail. And the letter to the Hebrews, in its great account of the faithful who suffered for their faithfulness, refers to people who were sawn in two. The tradition has consistently understood this as a reference to Isaiah. Sawn in two, inside a hollow tree. Let us stay with the specificity of that for a moment. Not killed in battle, not executed in a public space where the manner of death would be a statement, a symbol, something that could be used by those who followed him. Inside a hollow tree, hidden, private. The manner of the killing is the manner of something that someone wanted to be unremarkable, that someone did not want witnessed or recorded or turned into the kind of public martyrdom that creates movements and inspires resistance. Manasseh did not want to make Isaiah a symbol. He wanted him gone. And so the man who had stood before seraphim and kings and an Assyrian siege and a death sentence and 4 decades of non-reception, the man who had written the name of a king who would not be born for 150 years and the fate of a city at the height of its power, the man who had named his sons Shir Jashub and Maher Shalal Hashbaz and sent them walking through the streets of Jerusalem as living prophecies, the man who had delivered bad news to kings and been sent back to deliver different news, who had spent 60 years saying, "Here I am," and meaning it every time. That man was killed inside a hollow tree. No final speech, no recorded last words, no scene we can reconstruct, no gathered disciples, no moment arranged for maximum significance, just the end of a life, in a manner designed to leave no trace, at the hands of the people he had spent 60 years trying to reach. But here is what the silence around his death contains. When Isaiah was inside that hollow tree, at the end of his 60 years, the final chapters of his book were already written. The new creation was already on the scroll. The servant songs were already on the scroll. The comfort spoken over a people who had not yet experienced the exile it was comforting them for was already on the scroll. The name Cyrus was already on the scroll. The passage that Philip would one day read with a man on a chariot in the desert was already on the scroll. The words that a man from Nazareth would read in a synagogue on an ordinary Sabbath and then close and say today were already on the scroll. Manasseh could kill the prophet. He could not reach the scroll. The scroll was already in the hands of the people who would copy it and guard it and eventually hide it in clay jars in a cave above the Dead Sea, where it would wait in the dark for 2,000 years for a shepherd boy to throw a stone and hear something break. And here is the last thing we should say about Isaiah, the ordinary man. Before we move to the extraordinary vision that closes his book, he did not finish what he started. He did not see Cyrus. He did not see the return from exile. He did not see John the Baptist standing in the Jordan River with his hand on the shoulder of someone from Nazareth. He did not see the man who would stand in a synagogue and read the scroll and say, "Today." He did not see the servant songs find their fullest referent. He did not see the highway in the wilderness become the road the redeemed walked home on. He died inside a hollow tree, while a king who was filling Jerusalem with innocent blood was systematically undoing everything Isaiah had spent his life building toward. And he kept writing anyway, until there was no more writing to be done. That is a specific kind of faith. Not the faith that is sustained by visible results. Not the faith that draws on the confirmation of what you believed by the circumstances in which you find yourself. Faith that exists entirely in the space between what you know from the inside and what you can verify from the outside. From the inside, Isaiah had been in the temple. He had seen what he had seen. He had heard the holy, holy, holy. He had had a burning coal pressed against his lips and walked out of that building as someone for whom turning back was no longer an option. From the outside, 60 years under Uzziah and Ahaz and Hezekiah and Manasseh had produced approximately the results the commission had promised. Non-reception, refusal, the systematic dismantling of everything the best years had built. And he kept writing, because what he knew from the inside was not dislodged by what he saw from the outside. That is the ordinary man, not the biographies we usually tell about prophets. The dramatic visions and the bold declarations and the miraculous deliverances, all of that is in the book. But underneath all of it, holding all of it together, is something quieter and harder and more difficult to sustain. 60 years of here I am. 60 years of keeping writing. 60 years of knowing from the inside that what he had seen in the temple was real, in a world that was providing very little external confirmation of that reality, and of trusting that what he was writing would find its readers, even if he did not live to meet them. He was right about that. The scroll survived. It always does. Chapter 14, The New Creation. And yet, 2 words that carry more weight than almost any other 2 words in the book of Isaiah. And yet. We have just spent a chapter with an old man inside a hollow tree, with 60 years of speaking into a city that largely refused to hear, with the systematic dismantling of everything that the best years of his ministry had produced, with the particular grief of watching the son of the man who listened most carefully become the king who filled Jerusalem with innocent blood from one end to the other. And yet, at the end of this book, written by a man who died inside a hollow tree in a city that refused to listen, there is a vision, not a vision of exhaustion, not the muted hope of someone beaten down so thoroughly that what remains of their optimism is barely distinguishable from resignation. Not the careful qualification of a person who has been wrong enough times to stop trusting the larger things they believe. A vision of extraordinary, unqualified, cosmically proportioned hope. The most expansive thing Isaiah ever wrote is at the end of his book. After everything, after Ahaz and Manasseh and the Assyrian siege and the death sentence and 60 years of non-reception, after the servant songs and the suffering described with a specificity that has made serious readers in every century stop and ask questions they cannot easily answer. After all of it, he writes about a new creation. For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former things shall not be remembered or come into mind. New heavens and a new earth. Not a renovation, not the restoration of the old things to the condition they were in before they were damaged, not a repair of what is broken, or a recovery of what was lost, or a return to what used to be. Something new, something that has not existed before in the form it is taking. A creation that does not emerge from or depend upon the material of the old creation, but that comes into being by the same act that brought the first creation into being. And the former things shall not be remembered. This is perhaps the most radical claim in the entire book. Not that the former things will be redeemed, or that the suffering of the former things will be given meaning in the light of what comes after, or that the memories of the former things will be put into a context that makes them bearable. They shall not be remembered. Not because they did not happen, not because they did not matter, but because what replaces them is so complete, so comprehensive, so utterly sufficient, that the framework of memory that organized the former things no longer has the same function. The new creation does not need to be understood by reference to the old one, but be glad and rejoice forever in what I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem to be a joy, and her people to be a gladness. Jerusalem, the city that Isaiah loved and spent 60 years calling back to something better. The city that filled itself with innocent blood under Manasseh. The city that would be destroyed by Babylon and sit in ruins for decades. The city that the people whose suffering he was comforting had been carried away from. Jerusalem is being created again. Not rebuilt. Created. The language is the language of Genesis chapter 1. God creating, not repairing. Creating. The same act that brought the world into being in the beginning is being applied to a city in the end. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and be glad in my people. No more shall be heard in it the sound of weeping and the cry of distress. No more weeping. No more cry of distress. Hold that for a moment without immediately reaching for the theological framework that might explain it, because the emotional content of that sentence is worth sitting inside before the explanation is offered. Isaiah had heard weeping in Jerusalem. He had heard it from Hezekiah, turning his face to the wall and weeping bitterly before the God who had just told him he would die. He had heard it, in a different register, from the widows and the orphans and the poor that he described in chapter 1. The people whose weeping was happening while the temple was full and the sacrifices were being offered on schedule. He had heard it, one has to imagine, from the families of the people being killed under Manasseh. He had heard the city weep for 60 years. And he is writing, at the end of everything, about a Jerusalem where that sound is absent, not managed, not reduced to an acceptable level. Absent. The condition in which the thing that produces weeping has been so completely addressed that the sound itself has nowhere to come from. They shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. This is a specific reversal of a specific ancient horror. One of the most devastating experiences of the ancient world was the experience of building something and having it taken, planting a field, investing the labor of a season, and watching someone else come and harvest what you planted, building a house, pouring the work of years into its construction, and being driven from it by force. The ancient Near East was full of this experience. The conquest literature of Assyria and Babylon is partly a literature of exactly this, the taking of what others had built and planted, the systematic appropriation of the fruit of other people's labor. Isaiah is describing a world in which that experience does not exist, where the connection between effort and result is not subject to interruption by anyone with more power and less right to what you have made. For like the days of a tree shall the days of my people be, and my chosen shall long enjoy the work of their hands, like the days of a tree. The tree in the ancient world was the image of long-standing, deeply rooted, generationally enduring life. A tree does not produce its fruit in its first year. A tree invests decades in root systems and trunk growth before it begins the work of feeding the people who will eventually eat from it. And a tree, once established, outlasts the people who planted it. My chosen shall long enjoy the work of their hands. The long enjoyment, the generational enjoyment, the kind of relationship between effort and result that allows a person to plant something they will not live to harvest in full, knowing that the people who come after them will eat from it. Before they call, I will answer. While they are yet speaking, I will hear. This is perhaps the most intimate promise in the chapter. Not the cosmological scale of the new heavens and the new earth, but not the elimination of weeping and building and planting in their full extent. This is the specific, personal, relational intimacy of a presence that hears before the words are finished, before they call. Not even a delay, not a response after the prayer is complete, an answer beginning before the question has finished forming. The gap between the prayer and the response, the gap that Hezekiah experienced as the distance between turning his face to the wall and hearing Isaiah come back through the door with a different word, is described here as closing to nothing. Before they call, not even a delay. Now let us come to the passage that closes the arc of the entire book. The wolf and the lamb shall graze together. The lion shall eat straw like the ox, and dust shall be the serpent's food. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, says the Lord. The wolf and the lamb, the lion and the ox, the predator and the prey occupying the same space without the relationship between them being what it has always been. In Genesis chapter 3, the fracture of the creation introduced the predator-prey dynamic as one of its consequences. The ground cursed. The relationship between humanity and the animal world changed from one of shared participation in a good creation to one of competition and consumption, and the particular fear that lives in every creature that knows it may be eaten. Isaiah is describing the reversal of that change. Not the management of predation, not improved outcomes for prey animals in the current system. The elimination of the predator-prey dynamic as the organizing principle of the natural world. The wolf and the lamb grazing together. The lion eating straw. The serpent, whose food is dust. The dust it was condemned to eat in the judgment of Genesis 3. Still eating dust. But in a world where its enmity with humanity has been addressed at the root rather than managed at the surface. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. The holy mountain of God, which in Isaiah's prophetic imagination is both the specific geographical location of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and the universal symbol of divine presence and divine order, is a place where the fundamental violence of the current creation is absent. Not because the creatures have changed their nature by an act of will or moral development, because they have been placed in a different creation where the conditions that produce that nature no longer exist. Now let us step back and hold the full arc of the book we have been following. Isaiah chapter 1, a city full of injustice. A people whose worship has become disconnected from the ethical life that worship is supposed to produce. A God who says, I hate your festivals and your offerings because your hands are full of blood. Isaiah chapter 6, the vision. The commission that includes, in its terms, the information that the speaking will not be received. The yes given anyway. Isaiah chapters 7 through 12, the Emmanuel sign. The child with 4 names. The light in Galilee. The word spoken into the reign of a king who had already decided he was not listening. Isaiah chapters 13 through 39, the oracles against the nations. The Hezekiah narrative at the center. The stories of faith and failure, and a city that survived an impossible siege because a king spread a threatening letter before God and said, look at this. I have nothing else. Isaiah chapter 40, comfort. Comfort my people. The voice in the wilderness. The highway in the desert. The strength renewed for those who have no strength left. Isaiah chapters 42 through 53, the servant songs, building through 4 movements to the passage that has been debated for more than 2,000 years. The servant pierced for our transgressions, the grave with the wicked and the rich, the days prolonged after the cutting off. Isaiah, chapter 61, the Anointed One, standing up to read his own job description, and a man from Nazareth reading it in a synagogue and stopping in the middle of a sentence and saying, "Today." Isaiah chapter 65 and 66, new heavens, new earth. Jerusalem created to be a joy. No more weeping. Before they call, I will answer. The wolf and the lamb grazing together. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. That is the ark. From a city whose worship has become empty ritual, while the blood of the vulnerable soaks the marketplace, to a creation in which the fundamental violence of the world has been addressed at the level of its root, rather than managed at the level of its symptoms. From the commission to speak into non-reception, to the promise of a presence so intimate that it hears before the words are formed. From a servant who is pierced for the transgressions of others and makes his grave with the wicked and the rich, to a world in which sorrow and crying are no more, and the work of human hands is enjoyed by the people who made them. The book does not explain how the ark connects. It does not provide a mechanism that links the servant of chapter 53 to the new creation of chapter 65. It does not lay out a theological argument for how the one leads to the other. It simply places them in sequence, trusting that the reader who has followed the full arc will feel the connection even if they cannot fully articulate it. Something has to happen between the servant pierced for our transgressions and the world where the wolf and the lamb graze together. Something has to account for the movement from the accumulated weight of what the human story has produced to the creation that does not carry that weight. Isaiah does not name that something. He describes what was needed, and he describes what the result looks like. And he leaves the connection, as the best writing always leaves its deepest connections, in the space between the sentences that the reader's own understanding has to cross. But there is one more passage in the closing chapters that we should not leave without addressing, because it is the passage that makes the vision of the new creation not a private transaction between God and Israel, but something of cosmic scope. Isaiah chapter 66, verses 18 through 23. For I know their works and their thoughts, and the time is coming to gather all nations and all tongues, and they shall come and shall see my glory. All nation, all tongues. This is the book that began with a single city on a single hill in a specific corner of the ancient Near East. A city that had convinced itself that its particular election gave it a particular exemption from the consequences that applied to everyone else. The book that addressed Ahaz and Hezekiah and Manasseh, that spoke about Assyria and Babylon and Persia, that was written by a man who was royal adjacent and connected to the power structures of a small nation trying to survive between empires. And it ends with all nations, not Israel vindicated and the nations judged, not the city of God receiving its due while the peoples who had oppressed it receive theirs. All nations and all tongues coming to see the glory, all of them being gathered, and from them I will send survivors to the nations, to Tarshish, Puln, and Lud, who draw the bow, to Tubal and Javan, to the coastlands far away, that have not heard my fame or seen my glory, and they shall declare my glory among the nations. Survivors sent out, not to conquer, to declare, the language of witness rather than military expansion, the proclamation of something that those who have seen it cannot stop themselves from describing to those who have not. And they shall bring all your brothers from all the nations as an offering to the Lord, on horses and in chariots and in litters and on mules and on dromedaries, to my holy mountain Jerusalem, says the Lord, just as the Israelites bring their grain offering in a clean vessel to the house of the Lord. A procession of return from all the nations to the holy mountain, the same direction as the highway in the wilderness, the same destination as the redeemed who walk the way of holiness with singing and everlasting joy upon their heads. But now the travelers are not only the exiles of Israel, they are from all the nations and all the tongues. The gathering is universal. This is the vision the book ends on. Not a private restoration, not the vindication of one nation at the expense of the others. A gathering that includes everyone who was lost. From every direction, in every language, by every mode of transportation available, coming to the same mountain, to see the same glory that Isaiah heard in the temple, in the year Uzziah died, when the seraphim called to one another, and the thresholds shook, and the smoke filled the house. Holy, 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 the whole earth is full of his glory. Isaiah wrote that in chapter 6 as the declaration of the seraphim around the throne. He ends his book with the whole earth, all its nations and all its tongues, gathered to see the fulfillment of what the seraphim announced. The vision that broke him open in the temple is the vision the whole book has been building toward. The whole earth full of his glory. And the book that contains it, the scroll that carries this vision from the temple in the year Uzziah died, to the last chapter where the wolf and the lamb graze together, and all nations come to the holy mountain, was written by a man who died inside a hollow tree while a king was filling Jerusalem with innocent blood. He did not live to see any of it, but he saw it. In the temple, in the year Uzziah died, when the ceiling opened and the seraphim covered their faces and the thresholds shook and the smoke filled the house, he saw it then, and he wrote toward it for 60 years. And the writing survived. We began with a boy throwing a stone into a cave and hearing something break. Let us end there too. Not with the theology, not with the summary of arguments made or passages examined or connections traced across 8 centuries of prophecy and history and the specific, costly, 60-year life of a man who woke up every morning in the same world everyone else woke up in and went out and did the most difficult thing a human being can do. Let us end with the cave, with the dark inside it, with the clay jars that had been sitting in that dark for more than 2,000 years, with the hands that placed them there, carefully, deliberately, in a moment when something was coming that made it necessary to hide what mattered most. The people who lived at Qumran, who copied the scrolls and guarded them, and eventually sealed them in jars and placed them in the cliffs above the Dead Sea, were not people who had given up. They were not doing the work of despair. They were doing the work of people who understood that what they were carrying was too important to risk in the ordinary currents of history, and who believed with enough conviction to act on the belief that what they were carrying needed to outlast them. They hid the scroll, and then they were gone, and the scroll remained, the great Isaiah scroll, the one now housed in the shrine of the book in Jerusalem, the one that has been photographed and digitized and studied by scholars from every tradition and every language, is the same scroll they sealed in that jar in that cave. The leather that was touched by their hands was touched by the hands of the boy who found it. The words they copied with such care that the text is almost identical to the text transmitted through Jewish and Christian tradition for 2,000 years were the words that scholars photographed in 1947 and that have been read by people on every continent every day since. They hid it, and it survived. Now let us ask the question the whole story has been building toward. Why was it worth hiding? Not in the abstract. Not as a general question about the preservation of cultural heritage. Specifically, what is in those 66 chapters that made a community of people facing something they knew they could not survive decide that the scroll needed to outlast them? They had read it. They knew what was in it. They had read about the vision in the temple, and the commission to speak into non-reception, and the Emmanuel sign, and the child with 4 names, and the servant pierced for the transgressions of others, and the names written in the dark, and the highway through the wilderness, and the new creation, where the wolf and the lamb graze together. They had read all of it, and they decided it was worth hiding, not worth fighting for in the immediate moment of crisis, but worth preserving through the crisis, so that what was in it could be available to whoever came out the other side. They were thinking about people they would never meet. That is a specific kind of love. The love that prepares things for people who have not yet arrived. That plants trees whose shade it will not sit in. That hides a scroll in a cave, so that a boy 2,000 years later can throw a stone and hear something break, and find inside the broken jar the words of a man who died inside a hollow tree, while a king was filling Jerusalem with innocent blood. The community at Qumran had read Isaiah. They knew what it said about what happens to words that are true. They had read the promise that what God speaks does not return empty but accomplishes what it was sent to accomplish. They were trusting that promise with the thing they valued most. Now let us talk about what has happened to those words in the 2,000 years since the scroll was sealed in the jar. The words of Isaiah have been read in synagogues every Sabbath for centuries. In the cycle of prophetic readings that accompanies the Torah portions, Jewish communities in every country where Jewish life has existed have heard Isaiah read aloud in Hebrew in a continuous chain of public reading that stretches from the century of Isaiah himself to the present day. The words of Isaiah have been quoted more than 400 times in the documents of the New Testament, woven into the language of Matthew and Luke and John and Paul and the book of Revelation in a way that makes it almost impossible to read those documents carefully without constantly encountering Isaiah underneath them. The early Christians who wrote those documents were, almost without exception, Jewish people who had grown up hearing Isaiah read in the synagogue, who carried his imagery and his language in their thinking the way a person carries the idioms of their mother tongue. The words of Isaiah have been set to music that has reached audiences who have never opened the scroll. Handel's Messiah, which has been performed continuously since its premiere in Dublin in 1742, is built largely on passages from Isaiah. Audiences who have never sat with the text have wept at the music built from it. The words of Isaiah have survived, not without cost, not without difficulty, not without the specific grief of a tradition that has been persecuted and scattered, and at times nearly destroyed. But they have survived. The scroll that was sealed in a jar in a cave above the Dead Sea is now visible to anyone with an internet connection. You can look at the actual handwriting of the scribes who copied it in the 1st century before Christ. You can see the columns of Hebrew text, the specific letters, the way the pen moved across the leather. You can read, in the oldest complete manuscript of any biblical book ever found, the words of Isaiah 53, exactly as they existed before the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. The text was there, before any of the events that the text has been used to interpret. It was written down, copied, sealed, hidden, and preserved before any of the things that Christians have said it describes had happened. The questions it raises cannot be resolved by saying the text was shaped by the events it appears to predict. The text predates the events, which brings us back to the question that has been waiting patiently underneath everything in this story, from the first chapter to the last. Who is the servant? We spent an entire chapter with that question. We heard the 3 primary answers that serious people have given. We acknowledged the genuine force of the collective reading and the genuine problems it creates. We noted that the earliest Jewish interpretive tradition, before the 2nd century of the Common Era, included a messianic reading of the passage. We held the question open. It is still open, and I want to end not by closing it but by placing you in the position of the person who asked it most honestly. Philip and the Ethiopian official on the road from Jerusalem. The official was a man of significant position and education and genuine religious seriousness. He had traveled to Jerusalem to worship. He had acquired a scroll of Isaiah, which was not an inexpensive thing in the 1st century world. He was reading it in his chariot on the way home, not casually, but with the kind of sustained attention that his journey to Jerusalem and his acquisition of the scroll suggested was characteristic of him. He was reading Isaiah chapter 53. Philip ran up to the chariot and asked, "Do you understand what you are reading?" And the official said something that is worth holding as the most honest position any serious reader of this passage can occupy. How can I, unless someone guides me? He was not pretending to understand. He was reading the text with the full force of his intelligence and his genuine spiritual seriousness. and he was admitting that the text was resisting him in the way that things resist you when they are larger than your current framework for understanding them. And then he asked the question, "About whom? I ask you, does the prophet say this? About himself or about someone else?" That is the question. Still the question. After 2,000 years of argument and commentary and scholarship and theological debate and community formation organized around different answers to it, that is still the question. About whom does the prophet say this? We know what Philip answered. Philip began with that scripture and told the official the good news about Jesus. We know the official was moved enough by what Philip said to ask for baptism at the first body of water they passed. We do not have the argument. We do not have the exegesis. We do not know exactly how Philip connected the servant of Isaiah 53 to the person of Jesus in a way that was sufficient to move a serious, educated, religiously committed man to that response. We only know that it started with the text, with these words, "The servant who was pierced, the lamb who did not open his mouth, the grave with the wicked and the rich man, the days prolonged after the cutting off." Philip started there and told the good news about Jesus and a man in a chariot in the desert, found in those ancient words something sufficient to change the direction of his life. Now here is what I want to leave you with. Not an argument. Not a verdict. Not the closing of a question that has been open for more than 2,000 years and that deserves better than being closed by someone else on someone else's behalf. Just this. A man in the 8th century before Christ stood in a temple in the year a king died, and the world he had known shifted beneath his feet. And the ceiling opened, and he saw something that no human language was adequate to describe. And he said, "Here I am." And he spent 60 years writing from inside what he had seen in that moment. Writing about things he could not verify, and people who would not be born for generations, and a creation that had not yet come into existence. Writing toward a horizon that he would not live to see from the outside. And dying inside a hollow tree at the hands of the city. He had spent those 60 years calling back to something better. And what he wrote survived. It survived Manasseh. It survived Babylon. It survived Alexander. It survived Rome. It survived being hidden in jars in a cave in the desert for more than 2,000 years. It survived being found by a boy who threw a stone. It is still here. The scroll is still open. And somewhere in these words, the same words that Philip used to begin a conversation with a man reading in a chariot on a desert road, is the question that every serious reader of Isaiah eventually arrives at. Not as a theological exercise, not as an academic problem to be solved and filed, as the most personal question available to a human being sitting with a text this specific, this old, this stubbornly present across all the centuries and all the arguments that have been made about it. The servant was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And with his wounds we are healed. About whom does the prophet say this? The scroll is still open. The question is still there. Take the time you need with it. But take it seriously. Because the man who wrote it did.